So yeah, Mark King. I know he was like a milk delivery guy on the Isle of Wight, and I think the story was, and I couldn't find it to verify it, but I swear it was something like one of the bottles broke or exploded or something, and then the shards hit him in the face, and that's how he got the scar on his face. So
Interesting.
not quite as cool as the Gary Moore story, but
And the Gary Moore story is more.
It's much cooler.
It's more chivalrous.
Yeah.
He's protecting his girlfriend in a pub somewhere from some harasser.
Yeah, apparently that's the deal.
Like a Robert Johnson scene where somebody smashes him in the face with a glass, and that's why he's got the scar.
Yeah, and I think the deal with like Mark King, that happened pre-level 42, before they kind of hit it. But I think with Gary Moore, when did Skid Row start?
Well, the band officially started, I think, 66 or 67.
Oh, okay.
And then Gary Moore came. He wasn't the original guitar player, and I think the original bass player, no, the original singer was Phil Lynott.
No way.
Yeah.
Oh,
and then
wow.
Phil left, and Brush Shields, the bass player and singer, he took over on bass. He supposedly taught Phil how to play bass, and then when I think he kicked him out of the band and gave him a bass as a parting gift. And Gary Moore came into the band, and they started working on original material stuff. And he was like 17, so he's scar free for up until that band was pretty much. I think the band was pretty much done by. There were most of their activity and most of the albums that they did were in between 68 and 70.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So Gary Moore was 17 at that time.
So Gary was a good decade into his career when he had his pub chivalrous
scar,
glass smashing, girlfriend defending accident.
See, well, now I have another whole new level of respect for the guy. I wasn't that clued into Gary Moore originally until I accidentally stumbled across this Skid Row, not that Skid Row, another Skid Row,
right?
Yeah, a pre-70s Skid Row from Glasgow or something like that. Some of these dudes from up north that were nuts.
Yeah. So everyone who's tuning in, Steve and I have kind of been talking about sort of rediscovering Gary Moore through, I guess, his first signed band. I don't know what he did before that, but yeah, check this out.
Skid Row. The original Skid Row.
Ripping.
They were a power trio.
When he was a kid.
This is Gary Moore at 17. Look at him. Little baby faced kid.
He's a little baby.
Yeah. And this is Brush, the singer and bass player, who is still with us. And
awesome.
And this is the drummer. That's
he doesn't need a name.
Yeah,
He's
does.
Just the drummer.
No, he was an amazing drummer, double kit guy. The people that are watching this, dig that up. His name will come to me in just a minute. He just passed away like 2 weeks ago.
No
and
way.
He turned out to be quite a famous drummer that played with a lot of people in England. He was quite famous. Actually, a really good singer too.
Oh, really, Wayne? Wow. Hey, Jeremy, how you doing? Can you see that, Steve?
Ian Pace. Wow. Well,
that's killing.
The original drummer from that band, they were from Dublin, Ireland, and the original drummer was. I can see how they would have, how Ian Pace could have figured into that conversation, because they were very similar kinds of players. Oh man!
Well, if you think,
every time I want to think of somebody who's close to my heart, their name just like goes right out of my pointed little head, and it's really frustrating. But
I always like to think, the drummers of that era, if you think they're in their 20s ish in the late 60s, these guys are born in the mid to late 40s.
Yeah.
Rock and roll was not being played in their houses at the very beginning. I mean, all these guys are steeped in swing, and it was absolutely apparent in most of these guys' styles. And it's kind of, unfortunately, missing.
Well, the drummer's name is Noel Bridgman.
Noel
Bridgman. And
he just passed recently, huh?
2 weeks
ago.
Yeah.
Oh, look. Kelly B giving us the facts here.
And
right from Wikipedia.
Yeah, his nickname was Noleg. And he and the bass player met when they were 10 years old.
Oh.
And they were best friends up till this day, to the present day.
That's beautiful.
And I follow his Facebook page. He's quite an active character. He's not some burned out old grimy dude. He's had heart surgery a couple of years ago, but he's when you listen to the old records and then you see the recent stuff of him doing stuff, he's just like, guy's on fire. He's slim, he's energetic, he's just got that. It's just what you want to see. Somebody that you go, man, that guy was amazing. And what just happened? You go, oh, look, he's still bouncing off the walls, just like he was in 1968.
Oh, man. I have to say, I got a real shot in the arm. I think it was 2015 when I saw, unfortunately passed now, but Dick Dale over at Joe's Bar in Burbank. And oh my God, he had incredible tone. He was using the same stuff that Leo Fender gave him in 1962.
Yeah, Blonde Showman.
Exactly. Cranked all to hell.
All the way up.
Incredible tone. He had just gotten back off tour, and he was excited because I think he had to do the entire tour sitting down, but he had gotten back to LA, gotten his dialysis done, and was able to stand up the entire show. And I'm watching this guy. I forget how old he was at that point, but it was like, okay, I need to rethink this life thing. Like, you really can do this for a long time and love it.
I saw him a year before he passed.
He was burning.
He's playing trombone. He's playing
incredible sax. Tone.
He's like, he played trombone. He played sax.
That's right.
He played some drums. He played the worst, most horrendous version of Smoke on the Water you ever heard. But he just wanted people to know that he felt relevant and contemporary and stuff like that. But he was a great storyteller. And I met him once and we talked, and he was just crackling full of energy. I loved it. And I saw him at the American Bar.
Yeah, that's the one. Joe's American Bar over in Burbank.
Wait a minute. You saw that show?
Yeah, 2015.
You mean we were both at that show and I didn't see you?
It was pretty packed. And one thing that was really interesting was
we've known each other since then, so that's be really surprised that I didn't see you in that show. Was it one night or 2 nights?
I only saw him the one night. But
the amazing thing about him is he's like, okay, I'm doing this show because I'm using it to pay for my kidney dialysis, and my wife is using it to pay for her MS treatment or something like that. They were like that. That was their health insurance. They were literally playing to live. It was kind of like tragic and mind-blowingly amazing at the same time.
Yeah, but his attitude was pretty off the charts. Like,
totally. Hey, yep. But so what? Hey, that's life.
I'm here, so let's hit the stage and have some fun. I remember they were playing in the bar clips, the movies that Dick had done in the 60s. And you're looking at that like they're playing it during the show. And so you're seeing 60s Dick Dale juxtaposed with, the older Dick Dale. But you're going, damn, it's still the same energy. He's just up there killing it. And the only thing, I don't know if you remember this, but he said, sometimes I forget how my songs go in the middle of the song. And he had a couple moments like that, but he just laughed it off like, okay, whatever.
Yeah, like you're loud, dude.
It was a great show. I left feeling so good, like new lease on life kind of thing.
Yeah, my wife and I were the same way. We walked out of there and went, life is grand. It's effing grand. Look at those two.
And I have to say, no attenuators. He played loud, and it was glorious.
Well, yeah, but he was playing those amps not into distortion. He was playing them up to the maximum of their ability to play that sound that he got. So it wasn't like a full right hand sweep.
No.
He just needed it to be heard and clear. And by that time, he didn't really need it to be loud anymore. It was just like when you've done it that way for 50, 60 years, you don't go, oh, this new sound system, great, I can turn down. No, he wouldn't be that way. He would just be like, if you turn that knob down one notch, you're screwed because it doesn't sound any good anymore.
Yeah.
That's where the amp's sweet spot is. And it wasn't overdriven, and it wasn't scorchingly loud or brittle on the top end or anything like that. So there was no real reason to try to tame it. It was just right. It fit right in with the volume of the drums and the bass, and I think that's what you went to hear. You went to hear that big clean. You wanted to hear the pick banging off of every string. Da, 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 da. That's what you went to hear.
Right, big and clear. And I think he used massive strings. Like I think it was a 13 on top or something crazy like that. And it was, the amps were compressing a little bit, enough to get that nice harmonic kind of, but it was big and clean, and just like you said, no brittle anything, just gorgeous, man. Somewhere I took video that night too, because I didn't want to forget. I don't normally go into shows taking video, but it was like, this is pretty magical, and I don't know how much longer he's going to be here. So that was something.
Yeah. I think a lot of people don't realize that, the JBL D120s and D130s were considered these high-powered, technically evolved speakers, but they were Alnicos with just a fancy magnet shape.
Huh.
And I don't know, the people that really know about speakers would know this, but people that don't would never have noticed or known that there's no JBL literature, published literature at the time those speakers were produced, that said what the power rating was.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Because if they told you what the power rating was, and I think the reason that they did this is because they're talking about the 2 or 3 inch voice coil, whatever it was.
Mm-hmm.
And the big magnet structure on the back. Mm-hmm. Well, that big structure on the back weighed like crazy, and it was huge, and everybody just assumed it's got this massive giant magnet, blah blah blah.
Right.
That wasn't the magnet. That was a focusing mechanism for the little Alnico magnet inside in the middle.
Okay, I'm getting schooled right now. I had no idea.
It's the whole idea is to focus the magnetic field into the voice coil gap. And it was a big voice coil. So that, and an Alnico is a little tiny slug, and it's really expensive. So its field of influence is pretty small because it's a small little piece of magnet. So how do you get a magnetic field that's coming from a small little magnet out to a larger diameter voice coil? You use, you know how anti-magnetic watches work?
No.
Well,
I have no idea.
One way to improve the accuracy and reliability of watches when they were still mechanical devices was to prevent a magnet from affecting their behavior if they got too close to a magnet. So they were advertised as non-magnetic, and they had a steel case around the outside that deflected a magnetic field around the guts. So the magnetic field wouldn't impact the inside of the workings of the watch. And it's kind of the same but opposite concept in the JBL, where they're using this big chunk of metal to form the field around to where they needed it to be focused on the voice coil gap to get the efficiency out of it. But it was a pretty delicate speaker, and it was easy to blow because it was really only about a 60, 70 watt speaker.
Oh,
But you just looked at it and saw how it was built and assumed, this thing's probably got 300 watts or something. And of course, EV and Gauss came out with, well, ours are 300 or ours are 400. And meanwhile, all this time, JBL's never saying a word about their power rating. But you have to think, all right, how do you have two D120s in a twin, these big, giant, massive speakers that still managed to blow them to pieces? Because that's what was happening.
So,
because it was an open back cabinet, because they were low powered speakers and they just happened to have a lot of high end efficiency and they were easy to just rip themselves apart.
So if there's no literature on the power rating, are the engineers and the people kind of behind that kind of lost history? Do we know who came up with that concept, or is it just kind of?
I don't know. I just know that I never saw any published specs on the power rating of a JBL, and I brought that up to somebody else. It might have been Paul Rivera, and yeah, they never talked about that.
Oh, that's so funny.
As far as I know, it never got talked about. It was probably an industry secret, and other manufacturers knew that. But those were in the days when other manufacturers didn't out other manufacturers to gain a competitive edge. They just sort of
right
talk about their benefits of their product, not the deficiencies of the competitors, if they had any class,
Well, it's also kind of an illustration of how over time there's kind of been a dilution of power. Whereas, if you think about that time period, the corporation was the figurehead, and all you needed to know was, JBL, we make these speakers, and that's that. Nobody cares who built the damn thing or designed it, right?
Right.
But as time moves on, it's like people actually want to know, who's the Wizard of Oz? Who's behind the curtain? Who's actually at JBL designing the speaker? What's her? Why am I forgetting her name? The woman who winds the secret pickups at Fender. Who? What's her name? Somebody chime in and help me out.
Juanita, somebody, a name like that.
Anyway, that kind of over time kind of became a selling point, and that's, do you have the whatever her name is, those pickups in your 69 reproduction Strat or whatever. And but back then when she was actually doing the stuff in the vintage guitars, nobody cared who she was.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, when we started working with, I remember
Abigail Ibarra. That's right. Thank you. Ding, 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 ding.
Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, the Abby pickups. That's right.
Yeah. Right. So they got together with her and they took pictures of her and showed her winding a pickup and all this. And they did a marketing campaign around that. And I saw that. And that's at the time that we started working with Fane to develop the new Fane speakers that we use. And they have an Abigail at their factory in Fane that was around in the 70s when the original Fanes were being made. And she was, they told me about her, and I said, do you have any pictures of her? And they had a picture, they sent it to me. And I went, okay, you guys go sit her on a stool in front of a voice coil winding machine and just iPhone. It doesn't have to be any good quality. I don't care. Just get her on video winding a voice coil by hand. Yeah. And they went, oh yeah, we'll do that. Well, they never did it. They did send me a picture of her. And she did a similar thing. I think the video that they showed Abigail, she was using a pencil to guide the wire on the pickup.
Okay.
And same thing. Here's this woman, she's holding a voice coil and she's using a pencil or some straight device, and she's got the perm. In Japan they call it the obapama. Oba is old woman and pama is Japanese English, butchered Japanese English for perm.
Okay.
Old woman perm, obapama.
Okay.
So she had the obapama, and she's got she's the cat's eye glasses and the big smile, a sweet smile on her face, the blouse. Aww. And I'm like, I want that. Well, they never gave it to me, and I just want, you guys just blew an opportunity because
no kidding. And give her a raise.
You know what guitar players would give to see and learn and know that that's behind the legacy of the speakers and stuff like that, and it just went right over their pointed little heads.
It's all about the stories. People want the stories. What is the story behind this thing?
Speaking
Abigail
of the story,
Ibarra was working at Fender back in the glory days, and she's still winding pickups. What do you got there?
Tonight's recipe courtesy of Herradura tequila.
Wow.
So we're using Herradura tonight.
That's beautiful. I'm in an undisclosed bunker with not my normal libations, so I'm just drinking red wine. I'm happy to have it.
I was gonna grab a bottle of wine, but then I saw the Herradura on the shelf, and the reason I grabbed it is because when I started working at Valley Arts, I sort of walked in to an ongoing concern that was populated by most of Paul Rivera's clientele. So I kind of had to start out by filling his shoes until I started developing my own clientele, people that came there because I did something for them that they liked and they came back. So one of the first guys I sort of cultivated as as part of my new retinue of clients was this guy, Randy Mitchell. Session touring guitarist, great chops, great ears, great sense of humor, great guy to hang out with and shoot the shit. And he brought in an old Marshall that he wanted fixed, and I fixed it for him, and we chatted a bit, I'm a little slow today. I hit the margaritas a little too hard the night before, and he's like, "You a tequila guy?" And I'm going, "Oh yeah." He goes, "Have you tried Herradura?" And I'm like, "No, I never heard of it." And he goes, "Okay, well, I'll be back next week to pick up the amp." When he brought the amp back, when he came to pick up the amp, he brought me a bottle of Herradura in a gift box, and I just went, "Oh my God," And we stayed buddies ever since.
That's beautiful.
Motorcycle tripping together. He played with all kinds of great people, and so naturally he's got all kinds of great stories. But what was hilarious about him is he wasn't one of those like out front wailing. He was one of those guys that sort of stayed back a little bit and laid down the foundations and played the nice parts and made sure everything was like where it was supposed to be and all that. He was like a real focused pro.
Not all of us are exhibitionists.
Yeah, he was not an exhibitionist. He was a great player, and he was like really into Gary Moore and Angus Young and all these different people. And I'm like, oh, and so we went out drinking together and stuff, and we had lots and lots of fun. And he turned me on to some stuff about speakers that he liked, and I turned him on to some stuff and tried some things on some of his amps. And he would tell me stories about some of the tours that he went on, and he played with Debbie Boone.
Oh, really?
He toured with Debbie Boone and Pat Boone in Vegas.
Awesome. That's awesome.
And the stories he told about Debbie Boone, Debbie Boone, the born again Christian, the perfect, nice, super, like her behind the scenes. He said you couldn't even go into her trailer. It was such a god awful disaster mess that you couldn't even get in it. It was it was just chaos. And he said the stuff that came out of her mouth, man, she like kept that stuff locked down when she went in front of an audience, but behind the scenes, she was like a terror. And it was it was Pat Boone, actually. He was the guy that had it all together. He was like really nice. Debbie was like, woo! She was the Linda Blair of that troupe. And, so
Linda Blair.
So he told me all these great stories about stuff like that. And he toured with Donna Summer for a long time.
Cool.
And somebody asked what this is over my left shoulder over here, and is that a big toroid? And yes, that is a big toroid. What this is the it's the first production prototype of the second series of 2150 power amps.
Oh.
So we built 100 of the very first design, and then changed the design of it and turned it into the Rev 2. And this was the prototype for that. And
what was the impetus for the changing the design and going the other direction?
Well, we'll get to that actually.
Okay. All right, cool.
A little later on, but since somebody asked about it, first of all, that reddish color, that's rust. The chassis never got painted. So that's
really?
It's been rusting since 1991.
Oh, we got to take a picture of that and get a close, because it doesn't look like that from my vantage point. That would be really great to take a picture of.
got the original GE 6550s in it with the logos printed on it. And
wow.
It's got
so what year are we talking here?
And the funny thing about it is when Randy was touring with Donna Summer, I was just starting a company, and he came over and he says, "Yeah, I'm starting to build a little rack thing," and because that's what everybody's doing. And he says, "Do you got a power amp that I could check out?" And I said, "Hey, I'm working on the new version of the 2150." And he goes, "Oh, I want to check that out." And I said, "Well, I only have this thing right now, but if you want to just like take it for a couple of days, you're welcome to." So he took it, and I didn't see him for a month and a half. And just like that, no front panel, no, just 2 screws holding the top.
That's almost Pete Anderson-esque.
It was the predecessor to the. He did it before Pete and better. Because he got his guitar tech to bolt it in the bottom of a rack case, and he left town with it and went on tour with Donna Summer and did like 6 weeks of dates with it around the country. So I didn't even know he's gone out of town. I just got busy, and then when I tried to call him, I couldn't get a phone call back for a while, and then finally he calls me up. He says, "Hey, yeah, I'm back in town," and I said, "I've been trying to get the power amp back out from you." He says, "Well, I was using it," and I said, "What do you mean you were using it?" He says, "Oh, You told me I could check it out, so I took it out on the road with you." I said, "How did you even put it in a rack? There's no rack. There's no brackets. There's no." He says, "Oh, we just bolted it in on the bottom and with hanger wire and chewing gum and
that's what I have a guitar tech for."
They took it out and they rolled that thing out on the road just like that for 6 weeks and brought it back in. Yeah, sounds pretty good. So you going to make more of them? And I was like, "Yeah. As a matter of fact, now that I have the prototype, I can finish the production." He was like, "Oh, cool," oblivious.
Yeah.
To the fact that I'm going, I'm stopped dead until I have that back, so that I can start building out the bill of materials and the specifications for the production and all that. And he was just like, "Yeah, we took it on the road."
Yeah, that sort of thing is lost on people a little bit, I think.
It was shiny when I gave it to him.
Oh, really?
And it was starting to develop rust because they were in Florida, high humidity.
Yeah.
Indianapolis, they played a bunch of shows in places in the summer when the humidity was high in some parts of the country. And as it came back, already the rust was starting to set in when it came back. And I was just blown away. Did it give you any problem? No, it was flawless the whole time.
Is the green switch in there stock? Was that from the time period too?
Yeah, we've been using that since the very beginning.
I love that. Man, that's cool.
Yeah.
Wow. And then it's so great juxtaposed with what's right underneath it. That's perfect.
Just to give you an idea, it's like the LX2 is a little more than half the power of the 2150 and 1/4 the size.
Look at that thing, man.
1/3 the weight. So
how many years between the genesis of both of those units are there? I mean, obviously that's growth right there. Sorry to make you do math.
What's the question?
So the top unit dates from what year?
1991.
1991, and then that LX2. When did that debut officially?
Officially, we started shipping them 2 years ago.
Okay, man.
Yeah.
And then look at it. That's something else.
Well, like you mentioned about Pete Anderson, we have the funky no front panel rusted version of the LX2 that 30 years later, Pete Anderson pulled the same thing. "Hey, man, I need to reduce me." He's got a 252 power amp in his rig.
Yeah.
And we need to scale down the rig a little bit. What can you do? And I said, "Well, I have this I'm working on." Great. And he's not the kind of guy that asks a bunch of technical questions because he could honestly give a rat's ass.
Yeah.
He cares if it works or not.
Yeah.
He was the guy that when I first met him, it was his guitar tech calling saying, Pete Anderson needs a 300-watt tube amp for his rig.
No, he doesn't.
And that was my reply. Yeah, no, he doesn't. No, he doesn't. Nobody does. No guitar player needs a 3. I'm sorry. Well, no, Pete does. For what? Well, for his two cabs. Oh, tell us about his cabs.
Right.
Pray tell. Oh yeah, well they're deluxe. They're the size of deluxes because he's really into deluxes. So they're two 112 extension cabs the size of. Okay, so they're open back.
Yeah.
And they have what in them? Oh, an EV. But we're working on a speaker with Eminence, so it's going to be the Eminence Pete Anderson signature speaker, which is a much lower powered speaker.
I was going to say, is going to be rated at what? I mean, come on.
Yeah, 100 watts on a good day.
He's a deluxe dude. He's been a deluxe dude forever.
That was his hemp cone Pete speaker. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, yeah, right. I said, okay, here's what I'll do. I'll give you a 252 and a 292. And you tell me either which one works for you or that neither one of them work for you and that you need, and one of them is 100 watts aside and one of them is 50 watts aside. Well, just give me the 100. The 50 won't cut it. I said, I'll tell you what, I'll just take them both. Let's not talk about power ratings right now because I don't want to bore you to death. Just take them both.
Play them.
They're already ready. You'll have them right there. You can A/B them just to listen to the tone. I said it that way so that they would go, oh, tone. Okay, we'll listen to it for the tone because we know that they won't have enough power. Mm-hmm. And I said, so if that one's 50 watts aside and the other one is 90 watts aside. So if you find that you need 3 times as much power as the big one, you be sure and let me know right away, And a month later, he calls me back. He says, "Okay, well, we like put everything through the paces, and he likes the 252."
That's awesome. Yeah,
I didn't throw it in his face. He'd probably been so busy he didn't even remember the conversation in the first place.
Sure.
It was just like so. There wasn't any recriminations or any like, "See, I told you so." It wasn't anything like that. It was just like, okay. We'll just be patient with each other and we'll just get through this process.
But it's probably gratifying on your end, to get this request and sort of know ahead of time, okay, actually, I think I know what you're looking for, maybe more than what you're requesting, and then to have it come back sort of like, yeah.
The validation is nice because it's you do something a long time and you think a little thing or two about it. And every once in a while somebody will surprise you and they come up with, they throw you a curve and you go, you know what? I never really thought about that.
Oh yeah.
That happens once in a while. So that's nice when it does, because then you learn a new thing. But when you know that what that's going to happen next, and that was a situation that I like going, I will bet a year's salary on this one.
Yeah.
Just prove me wrong. Please prove me wrong.
Yeah,
I'm bored. I want to learn something new.
Right, and they're rolling their eyes, going out the door, but just go do it anyway.
Yeah, and so came back 252. He used it for 10 years.
Wow.
And he had me put 6 L6s in it once, and I said that's not going to really work as well, because changing the bias doesn't really make it a full-blown, honest-to-goodness 6L6 amp. It makes an EL34 amp with a different bias, and it won't be as efficient. It won't transfer power as efficiently or as dynamically, and it just won't be as good. But in peace mind, if it's got 6L6s, then it's practically a Fender,
But that kind of is sort of what we had talked about, maybe talking about tonight. It's right in line with people talking about, maybe we should play that Dave clip of
we'll
power
get
amp. People thinking of it.
That'll be the next thing after we get to the Rusty LX2. So
great.
That's where we were going with that, which was. He had me put 6L6s and I biased it. And then when he brought it back into servicing, after he had it like a year or two, he brought it over for servicing, getting ready to go out and do some shows with it again. And I got it and I put EL34s and biased it back to normal and gave it back to him. And he goes, it just sounds so much better now, man. It really needed that servicing.
Yeah.
And he says, so what 6L6s did you use? And I said, I put EL34s back in it this time. And he's like, he just started laughing.
That's very interesting.
He says, I'm really learning to trust you after 10
Right.
years. It's just like we've just built a relationship over time, just out of common interest in the music that he was playing and all that stuff, and just having a good time talking. It was never really technical or anything has to be like this. It's like a laid back guy, and you could just throw him a curve like that and he would just go, all right, good enough for me.
I had a very similar experience working with Don Grosh.
Oh yeah.
And talking about Strats. I've been a Strat guy since the very beginning. And I had always sort of subscribed to, I've owned a 54 Strat. I still own a 57 Strat. I've owned a 64. So, I've a lot of experience with the old golden age instruments. And, I subscribe to all the stuff that you hear, you want the guitar to have, the cold rolled steel trem block and this sort of thing. And I remember when I'd met Don and I was hanging out at his shop and playing his guitars, he was using zinc blocks, which people think is like, that's just heresy, right? You don't do that. You don't do what do they call it? The swimming pool route in a Strat. Like, you don't do that. Okay. Well, Don does some of these things, but I brought my old 57 Strat in, which is the best sounding Strat I'd ever had. And Don just walked me through it like, well, look, this is my personal recipe. And so this block works for my particular design. And we would just play through amps. And, it's that same sort of thing that Pete probably had with you, where at the end of the day, I'm going, you know what? Okay, I'm suspending all of this stuff that I've always been told, and I'm just deferring to you because you obviously know what the hell you're talking about. You've been doing this, and the results.
The zinc block, for example. This is the thing where people get glommed onto a concept that they've read about online, but they're not engineers. They're not, they're not metallurgists. They don't.
Right.
They don't. There's things in there that nobody talks about because they don't know how to talk about it. But for example, zinc is very dense. It's very heavy. So mass and resonance are a big part of those things, not just that it's steel or zinc. A zinc block is probably a little bit heavier than a steel one. It's just a big, heavy kind of material. And actually, no, it's the aluminum that's heavier than zinc. Zinc is actually pretty light. Now that I think about it, I'm going to retract that. But it's massive, but it's lighter weight. So it would have a different resonant frequency. And the resonant frequency, and we talk about resonance all the time because that's all we're going to talk about for a while because that impacts what we're talking about so much. But there's that. And resonant frequency has everything to do with how a guitar behaves, much more than, it's a material that the guitar is made of. Well, why does that material affect the behavior of the guitar? Because it's steel? Because it's zinc? No, because of the resonant behavior of those parts. Not because of the metallurgy of them, not because of the molecules that make up the steel, but how that thing behaves, that cast piece of metal behaves versus this other kind of metal cast.
So it becomes a recipe. That's the thing that I learned.
And that's what Don was telling you. It's a recipe.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
So when Pete comes around and he wants to shrink his rig down and he says, I'm working on the prototype of the LX2, and he goes, great. When can I see one? And I said, well, you can take this one. And I need it back on Monday, but you can take it, today. So he takes it away, and I expect it to come back on Monday. And 6 weeks later, the guy calls up. Yeah, that amp worked great. We had one problem with the tube, so we replaced a tube in it. It just got broken in shipping. But broken in shipping? What are you talking about? We went down to New Orleans and we went to blah blah blah, and we did like a Southern Circuit tour for 6 weeks, and we played all these blues and R&B and Cajun clubs, and we're back. And I'm like, that you were only supposed to have that like 2 or 3 days. He said, oh really? I don't remember you saying that. And of course he didn't tell Pete. Pete didn't care. Pete just, hey, throw it. It sounds great. Throw it in the rack. Let's go. In the truck, boom, they're gone. And you didn't have any problems with it? Well, like I said, the tube cracked. We replaced that, but we didn't have any problems with it. Did it get hot? No, it didn't get particularly hot.
That's the best thing because I've seen that prototype, and there's no venting and there's no fan.
That's right. So it went out on the road 6 weeks.
Unbelievable.
With no thermal vents anywhere on the chassis and no fans installed in it. And why would you put fans in it? Because there's no vents in it, so there's no place for the fans to go. And why is there no vents in it? It was a prototype chassis. It wasn't meant to actually hold a working amplifier out in the field. It was just a box where we were determining the shape and verifying the dimensions. And then the next pass was going to get the slots punched into it. And like, oh, it would get hot, huh? Like,
I love that story.
When people talk to us about, gee, is it going to get hot? That a little, all those tubes in that little one rack space. Do you think it'll be? Hey, ask Pete Anderson how hot it got. He probably wouldn't even have known because he wouldn't have touched it. And he had a Line 6 Pod Pro.
Yeah, I know he was doing that thing for a long time.
Right on top of it. No extra space to worry about. He never called once and said, he never said, hey, we're going to go out on tour and we're going to throw this thing in the rack without any rack brackets. We're just going to sort of bolt it in there somehow. Do we need to put any space above? He didn't ask any of that. Space above it and below it. He just off they went. And when they came back, I checked it all out and scoped it and well, I love this. It's like,
I love this.
It's like the field research I never would dare to do to somebody on tour, because if it went up in flames, it would be my ass, right? But
right, exactly.
But they absolved us of all responsibility by just, were we not supposed to take that?
Yeah.
Great, thanks. That's valid research and development as far as
to everyone who's watching this, I actually. We talked about this unit a couple weeks ago, and Steve pulled it out. That's why I'm saying I saw it, and I took some video of it. So we'll post that pretty soon, so you guys can see it. It's really pretty cool, and you can see literally. Now, what were you saying? Where did you get the actual chassis? With no venting, it's like a third party goofy sort of thing that you're plopping components in. Am I remembering that right?
No. When,
so I remember when you were opening it up, you're going, wait a minute, how's this thing open up? I don't quite remember this.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's just in the development process. So, I use a program to design the circuit boards and the chassis together within the same program. And to any of you guys that have any CAD engineering experience, no, it's not 3D. No, it's not AutoCAD. No, it's not. It's not any of the sophisticated 2D and 3D modeling software that have integrated circuit board design and schematic capture and metal fabrication stuff all together. It's just I use a relatively antiquated circuit board design program, and I build the chassis out in that program. I basically treat the sheet metal part as another circuit board with no components on it, just the shape and holes. And then so those are outlined around the circuit. So the circuit board is made, and then the chassis is drawn around the circuit board, and all the front and rear panel holes for the controls and jacks and all that are placed so that it's all of a piece. And then once the circuit boards are all complete, that part is copied out as a separate file and sent off to a circuit board house. And the sheet metal part, the circuit board house has a particular kind of format and outputting file transfer format that's different than AutoCAD. And all circuit board houses use that. No, it's not even as sophisticated as Eagle. It's PCAD, by the way, and which is no longer supported.
Oh, that's the best.
And I'm actually transitioning to another one because PCAD.
You're using vintage software, dude.
Yeah. Well, I mean, all the legacy designs are in it, and it's easy to just use that to copy and paste modules from other designs into a new design, and it saves me an awful lot of work. But eventually, it's going to be to the point where it's not supported, to the point where what the next version of Windows won't even operate it. And so I'm learning Altium now, which is a different sort of an animal. But in the meantime, any legacy work that I can get done, any current work that I can get done with the existing thing, it's just saves me time and effort, and I know it so inside and out so well, and then I can I can export the chassis parts of the files out as DXF files, and then those can be imported by the sheet metal fabrications. They can convert them to DWG files, which AutoCAD uses. So I have a transition medium that I can use. It just makes my life faster and less complicated. So in the process of making the circuit boards, and then we do an outline drawing for the chassis, and it's going to be this shape, and it's going to be this deep and this tall and this wide, and it's going to mount like this, and blah, 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 blah. And the controls are going to be here and there. And then we get what's called a first article made, just to verify that the shape of it is right, that it looks good in real life. We want to turn it in different directions. You can look at a design in 3D on a computer screen all day long, but you still don't have any idea what it looks like in real life until you get it in your hands and you look at it and go, oh man, this is the goofiest, stupidest looking thing. No matter how gorgeous it looked in 3D, and you could spin it around, and what you're doing is you're going, oh look, I can spin it around in 3D. Look, I can turn it around upside down. I can flip it. I can disappear the top and look inside. Isn't that awesome? But at the end of the day, when you put it in your hands, it's going to tell you, it's going to be the Frankenstein monster going, no, kill me. I don't want to live. This is too horrible of a life. So in doing a first article, I don't always finish all of the finishy stuff because we're not there yet. I know it's right. We'll get it to look right first, and then from there we can sort of just lay paper on the top of it and sketch where the vents should be, and then how cosmetically they might look a little better. We can just sketch that out on paper and tape it to the top, the bottom, and the sides, and sort of get a visual of it that way, and then go put them on. And then when we go to start the first production, where we're going to make 500 chassis sets, we'll get one more first article where it'll be the complete ready to fly one that we'll look at and make sure everything lines up and all the screw holes line up and all that, and everything fits together smoothly first before they run the whole batch. Okay. And that'll cost another $500 to $1,000 to do, but it's money well spent. Because if you don't do it and you build 1,000 chassis that don't fit together right, you're in real trouble, because you either got to do it over again or you got hours and hours of rework, which is expensive. So in the very early step, it's just get the shape together and let's feel, taste, sniff, all that. So plus at that time, I don't think we had worked out how the cooling system in the LX2 was actually going to work the best, and we had one of our other people making a prototype of a air dam with these fans to get air to flow through a certain way with a minimum amount of noise. And people still complain about the noise of fans, but fans make noise, but they remove heat. So we had this conversation before. The argument is, how much heat will you tolerate before the fans bother you? How much noise will you tolerate before the heat bothers you? And that's the nexus. And it's different for every person. And nobody's ever going to be happy. But if you want it small and you want it to be tubes, you're going to have to live on one side or the other of that line. So, and we get as much feedback as we can from players out there, but then we have to decide where the line is. Right. Because at some point it becomes a consumer liability issue. It's got to be safe. At the end of the day, it's got to be safe to operate. So if it's a matter of getting sued for personal injury or the fan being a little noisier, it's pretty easy. Right. Yeah. And we put a lot of time into the power amp thing. First of all, because it's the thing that we do. Right. And second of all, because it's coming back. And, people are asking, we can see it. People are asking about which tubes you're going to use. And no, most of the really good CAD programs are not on Mac. They're on PC. So thanks for the suggestion, but that doesn't apply.
So so what's it like to have something that I've actually never heard this asked of somebody who, well, I don't know. Leo Fender was probably on record before he passed, but you have built things that are now coming back around as vintage treasures. That, I mean, it's all over YouTube. We got people, like this rack thing's coming back, man. And you were there at the beginning of it. You were, one of the big players. It was, one of the things that, I mean, I imagine really established you up front. I mean, I think that was probably the first thing that I saw, as a, teenager reading guitar magazines. Woo! Look at that.
Yeah, well, the Pipple head was actually the prototype that existed way before the power amps existed.
Sure.
But the rack concept existed way before the Pitbull prototype existed. So the Pitbull prototype was made in 1987.
Okay.
But I was playing in bands in 80, 81, 82, 83, where I had a little homemade rack system built into a milk crate.
A milk crate?
Yeah.
Do you have pictures?
I have the milk crate.
Oh my God. This has got to be documented.
It's kind of full of stuff. I don't know if I want to drag it out right now, but it actually has the prototype of the preamp that I've had in it. And what I did was, because I told you this, I think we talked about it last time. I had a Super Champ that I tweaked a little bit, and then I toured with that.
Yeah.
And that was like my go-to sound, and I could take the line out on that and plug it into just about anything, and that was my go-to sound. So it was like a mini slave rig. It could either be, I could either use it on stage and send the line out to another bigger more powerful amp and keep the internal speaker running, or I could unhook the speaker and plug a built-in dummy load in the back, just unplug the speaker. Later on, I put a switch so I could switch between the speaker and the dummy load. And then the line out came out and went to another amp. So I could either use them together or not use them together. And why I would turn it off sometimes is if the speaker in the little combo was out of phase with the speaker in the cab that I was using, I would have to turn it off. So I had to have that option. So that's what I did for that. And then I got the wise idea that if I didn't really use any pedals, but I like to use delays. So if I wanted to have a delay in my rig and be able to carry that with me, it would be really convenient to have the Super Champ as maybe a little head and put that in a box with the effect, and then take that and send it out to the effect return of a couple of amps. So whenever we would tour, I would just try to get something that had effects loop in it, and I would use a pair of them or one of them, and just use the power amp section of that, like and a 412 cab or a 212 cab or whatever I could get my hands on, and that would be my rig. So I took the Super Champ and I built a copy of it in a little a 2-space chassis, and then I modified it, worked on it, tweaked it to get it to do all the things that I wanted it to do. And I made it channel switching. So I had a clean channel and a dirty channel on it. So that was that was between 83 and 85. I did that. And I was using it around town, and I had a little custom front panel made for it and all that. And I had no intention of going into production or doing a business or anything. I just did it for me. And people are, you know what, you could make those and sell them. And I'm like, the amount of, because it was all hand wired.
Yeah.
And I looked inside that and I thought, it'd take me 2 weeks. Now that I know how it all goes together, it would still take me 2 weeks of 8-hour days to build one for somebody. And what I would have to charge for that would be immense. I wasn't doing circuit board design at that time, and I didn't have any intention of doing that. So I just...
Was there even really a market? I mean, it hadn't really crested yet, right? I mean, what were people?
If I'd have gone and went, one guy who was really pushing me to do it actually had some money, and he was just like, "I can loan you the money," and I'm like,
Yeah,
I still got the music side of me, like
you were gigging,
you're
doing repairs. You weren't ready to start a company, right?
No, not even remotely. I was
mentally prepared to make that leap and take that
I
off.
would think about it for 5 minutes, and then I would go out on tour with some band, and I go, "What the hell was I thinking?"
Hell no. Yeah.
It was just no way in hell I was going to do that.
I got to get in the van and drive, dude.
I could be doing this. Well, I mean, there was some gigs that were I played some really nice gigs with some different bands, and so that was what I was there to do. The other thing was just a nuisance and a side project, possibly, and something to do if I didn't have any work and didn't have any money coming in. That was a fallback, absolutely, just pure and simple. It was simply a fallback. It wasn't anything I took remotely seriously. And then so years later, when a couple of people started coming out with preamps, I'm like, oh, so somebody did decide that it was worth their time. Okay, let's see how it goes. And it started taking off. And so there were effects and there were racks. And early on, when I was still doing that seminal sort of rack exploration stuff, I was Buzzy Featon was one of my clients. And he's a nut. He was like taking a hacksaw and just cutting amplifiers into pieces and then bolting them into a box. So he was basically doing what I was doing. So when we started talking, we were like of the same mind, it was like the Martian mind meld. It was just like I would say something and I would like finish his sentence. And we were like always thinking exactly the same things at the same time. And I would go, I had this idea. And he goes, hey, you know what I'm doing? Yeah, come on over to my place. So I drove down to his place in Venice, and he's got this thing.
I've heard stories.
It was a solid state Fender. It was during that Series 2 Fender.
Wait, was this the Rivera solid state period?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And he had one of those, and he had a hacksaw, and he was sawing it into pieces. Not to destroy it, but to separate it into its. But Buzzy, that isn't going to work because the preamp and the power amp are on the same circuit board, and a circuit board. And he says, "Yeah, I'm just figuring that out now." And well, here's what we can do this.
Thank you, Captain Obvious.
He was but he was touring too. I mean, he was out with Bette Midler. He was out with Cher. He's like doing all these high profile gigs and stuff. And then he would come back in town, and he would be flush with cash.
Okay.
Until he blew it all. And then he was broke. And then he would get another gig, and then he was flush with cash, and having been out on the road and trying to solve problems for him as a player. And he would bring them back to me and go, hey, I thought this and I thought that. And I said, funny you should mention that. I'm working on something like this. Oh, that's brilliant. And blah, 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 blah. And we would try these things. And the difference was that I was kind of choosy about the gigs I did. So if I went out, they really had to pay, and if they didn't pay, I didn't go out, but I would play locally a lot.
Yeah.
So I played, at the Whiskey and all the places around town, played locally a lot. And that paid pretty well. And it was fun. Wasn't my main thing, but at least it was playing and paying gigs.
Sure.
So I was close to home all the time. And the Valley Arts, I did pretty well working at Valley Arts. So I was never really hurting for money, but he would sometimes be like, goes to Guitar Center, and they give him, because he's a regular customer and stuff, they just he would go in there, I need a delay. Okay, here's the latest delay, here, take it. And if
Guitar
you like
Center
it,
was treating him that way.
Oh yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. He had carte blanche.
That's weird. It's not a relationship with the company. It's a relationship with the retailer. That's strange.
It was before the the days of the big sale, the
wild 80s.
Yeah. So he takes it, he immediately comes over to my shop and says, okay, I need you to do this. I need this thing to do this. I need to have a remote. It doesn't the remote switch thing. It's programmable, but I don't want all that MIDI programmable. Blah, blah, blah. I just want to be able to access these two functions, and I want them on a little mechanical foot switch.
Yeah, I want two cool sounds.
To do that. And I go, okay. Get the schematic, look in there. Okay, I can cut the circuit board here, make a little chop, then put a jack on the back, and blah 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 blah. And it's a tip ring sleeve, and here a little mechanical foot switch. And he had a Mark II, some kind of a Mark II amp that he used. And so he wanted it so that he could use one switch to switch channels on the Mark II and switch a program on this. It was a digital delay, or it was a reverb, or it might have been a compressor. I forget what it was.
Was it one of the Yamaha units?
It was a loaner. No, I think it was a Roland unit. It might have been.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
But he said, yeah, be real careful when you do it, don't make it look real obvious. And I'm like, oh, okay, you want me to do a clean job? Yeah, no problem. So I was very clean, and how I did it, there was a jack that wasn't being used, that he didn't particularly need. So instead of drilling another hole, I used that jack, and I just took the jack out and I put another jack floating off the PCB and hardwired it into this little buffer that I built in there, so they get a switching buffer, not an audio signal buffer, because it was a CMOS switching circuit, so it needed to be isolated from the outside world so you wouldn't blow the internal switching mechanism. So I built all that out. I did a really clean job, and he took it out and he played a bunch of shows, and he came back 2 months later, and he needed to, he owed Guitar Center the money for the unit. If he was going to keep it, it was going to be a good deal, but still he had to come with cash. And he brings it and he goes, I need you to undo what you did, and I need it to not look like it never been done.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask.
Yeah.
If that was why the request of it needs to be.
Yeah, really so I went in there and I surgically put it all back, and I touched up the connections where I
no way.
So I bridged them, and I used I had multicolored little Sharpies, the different circuit boards, and I touched them up. You could have gone through that thing with a microscope and not
so
found.
Hypothetically, somewhere out there is a formerly modded,
along with the 2 Marshall half stacks of SIRs in New York that I modified and gave them back to him modded after a tour. And those
were the ones that you modded on your own tour, right?
Yeah. Sometimes I wish I had kept the serial numbers of those, because there were 2 different ones, and they were pretty much brand new at the time, 85, 84, 85 JCM 800s. And I could just imagine, because SAR, whenever they got stuff back in from a tour, they would check it out.
Sure.
Play test it.
Well, you should.
Right? For the next client, right?
Exactly.
So we talked about this before, but only in the last couple of days, it occurred to me, I'll bet that when they got these things back in, they probably just play checked them and figured that they were okay, and looked them over to see if they were damaged, and they were okay, and put them back into stock. But maybe before they go out for a rental, they check them out one more time, like we do when we have loaner gear.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to imagine that one of them goes to one client, and then about a month later, another one goes to another client.
Yeah.
And the guy looks, wait a minute, this looks just like that one I checked out a month ago that had some strange additional resistor and capacitor in it that wasn't stock. And this is just like that. What's going on here? Did they come from the factory? I can just imagine some guy's wheels starting to go.
Yeah.
And it never occurred to me that it might be a story someday, and that I should have the serial numbers of those. And if I did, I probably would have lost them well before now.
Well, you were doing it more as a kind of out of needing to survive, because I think you and I talked about it. It wasn't during an aired version of this. Hey Michael, you were telling me, weren't you out on the road with your Esquire?
That was my go-to guitar.
Dickies with brand new
JCM 800.
Yeah, JCM 800s with brand spanking new cabs, brand spanking new speakers.
Yeah.
Oh, dude, that's duck and run for cover territory.
So I was used to high headroom, clean amps, because I was using 100-watt, high-watt half stacks.
Yeah, that's a different beast.
Stan was using a late 70s 50-watt head and a really beat to shit greenback cab with an SG, and that's all he ever used. One setting, saw on the guitar nap. He didn't know tone from anything. It was just like, this was his rig, and this is how you turned the knobs. He's one of those guitar players that hey Stan, if you do this, you can get, huh? But I said it here. just like but this one goes to 11. The same kind of intellectual level of conversation.
Kind of nods, tilts his head and then walks away and plays the game.
Exactly. Well, this is how I said it, and so he's playing through a brand new JCM 800 100 watt, and he's just like, it hurts my ears. And,
Ken, exactly. Boom, Ken's got it.
And we had to turn it. We had to turn them up. The bright cap is on the input gain stage. So the trick is on a master volume Marshall is just to keep that knob up, and you don't have to worry about the bright cap. You just keep the volume up and you keep the master down a little bit, and it's fine. And then when you turn it up louder, and the bright cap with the gain, up past 12 o'clock to between 12 o'clock and 3 o'clock, and that bright cap, that big bright cap, isn't going to matter so much. It only really matters when you turn it way, way down. And
but you weren't doing that.
But we weren't doing that, and not most people don't do that. And if you take it out and turn it down, then it sounds like you threw a blanket over it. So the whole bright cap conversation is kind of like it's one of those conversations. We'll probably have more of this tonight, where the perception of the way these things work and how they actually really do work and get used in real life there's some space in there. I don't mean to put you down, Ken. I'm not bagging on you. I'm just sort of pointing out that I experimented with that stuff when I was young too, and I'd take it out and go, nope.
Well, no, Ken's saying like I had to crank it. Like that's sort of the thing is volume solves a lot of problems with.
That was the point. That was why the bright cap was big, because if you had a small bright cap and turned the gain way up, then it would be too muddy. So the bright cap had to be bright enough that when you turned it up 3/4 of the way, it was still adding some sparkle to the sound, or else it would just be bleh.
Yeah, that makes sense.
There's, whether you like it or not, there's always a practical reason for people doing things the way they do in production, because they do get so much feedback from artists. And artists like, not some guy down the street, but artists like Jimi Hendrix, and artists like John Sykes, and artists like Steve Vai, and all these people that really know and have zeroed in on what they're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
And they may not have any clue what's going on inside the amp or why, but what they do know is, just like Stan, I like it when you turn it here.
Yeah. Can I get what I need out of this
right
piece of kit?
And if I'm getting what I need, I don't need to be talking to anybody else about it until I'm not getting what I need. And then I need to make some phone calls. It's all of the moment. And
I don't need to know how electricity works to flip the light switch.
Exactly. And you're better. I didn't want to know that. I went to great pains to not know that stuff. It was one of those
I hardly believe that.
Angry, screaming muses that chased me down and demanded that I wrap my head around it, and I fought that tooth and nail so that I could focus on music. And but
you were solving problems for yourself when they popped up.
Yeah, but it was also a distraction. I could have easily just done what everybody else did and just plug in what's available.
Oh man, but
I went to Mike Soldano's shop and plugged into the SLO when they first came out, and I went, yeah, I mean, I get where you're going with this, Mike. It's really cool. It's like, for me, it's like 90% there, and I want 100% there. I could have easily said, I'm 90% there. Great, thanks, Mike. I'll take one, And then I could have just walked away from the impulse to build the better mousetrap. That was like a pivotal moment. I could have just turned and said, yeah, this will do. Yeah, this will do very nicely. It was good enough for one of my favorite Bob Bradshaw quotes. If it's good enough for Lukather, it's good enough for you,
Oh, snap. Yeah. But you know what? I mean,
out of his mouth, it probably didn't sound as benevolent, but that's I actually heard him say that to somebody.
So I never, obviously I'm just a guitar player, but there was a time period where every time I would have an issue with a piece of gear, I had a friend who I would go to, and I kind of hand it to him you know, do something with this, you know, fix this pedal, mod this pedal, change these pickups, whatever. And it was super instructive to me. This one particular day, I walked into this office at the guitar shop that he worked in, and I forget what I asked him to do. I said, you know, Chris, you know, this is my problem, and you know, I need you to fix it. And he said this thing to me that it just shamed me forever, and it changed me. He said, well, let's think about this. And like, it hit me upside the head. Like, wait a minute, you don't just know the answer. Like, you have to think about this. So what you're saying to me is, if I would just think about this, I could solve this too. Like, wow, I was really embarrassed. And I really didn't want to do that ever again. So I stopped going to him for my problem, and I solved them for myself. So I'm wondering if there was any sort of similar thing, like sort of a personal pride thing. Like, well, I could keep throwing money at this issue, or I could apply my gray matter and do something and fix it myself. Because I could almost see you having that sort of impulse, just knowing you enough as I do.
I think I was so busy trying to absorb knowledge about what the problem I was trying to solve is I didn't really think much farther than, let's just start tearing stuff apart. And then that's an impulse that goes way back to my childhood. My first impulse was to tear something apart and then figure out how to put it back together later.
Sure.
And it was the same with gear. And when I got over the awe and mystery of the high watts to the point where I could actually dare to unsolder a wire in them, the first one led to the second wire, and the second wire led to the third wire. And then before you knew it, I had one completely dismantled and schematics in front of me, and going, all right, let's put it all back together now. And so there was a fair amount of that. I had experience putting together the kit hi-fi tube amps.
Okay.
In the early days, when I was still in junior high and high school. So I had soldering technique, and I kind of knew what sort of these circuits did, but I really didn't understand how they worked. I just understood in generally that the different areas of the amplifier circuit were.
So you were a directions follower at that point, but you couldn't think your way through a circuit yet.
Certain parts.
Or you hadn't, not that you couldn't, you hadn't yet.
Yeah, certain parts of it I had explored, mainly the power supply, but when it came to the audio part and tone controls, that was a little daunting to me. I didn't start cracking that until later on, but and by the way, Mike Nielsen just jumped in, and I wanted to give a shout out to Mike for his new video today that he just popped up with.
Yeah, I want to watch that.
That he goes through all the synergy modules. There are a handful of them, 5 or 6 of the synergy modules, and shows them set up really nicely. And he's a great player, so he's got several of these modules, and they all have this thick, chewy sound, and people are going, man, yeah, that's you really got that module to sound really thick and chewy. I'm working on that. And he says right at the beginning of the video, all these modules are going into a PS2, and I'm using the Power Station 2 trick of plugging its output into its input to get power amp distortion. And if you look at the picture of the PS2, the volume control is almost at 12 o'clock. So it's well into the point where the power amp is starting to compress. So yeah, all those modules sound chewy because that chewy, that thing that's going on in there is coming from the way he's got the PS2 set up. So they all sound awesome. But the great thing is that's how you can make them sound awesome. So thank you, Michael. That was a beautiful and brilliant strategy on your part. And I know that you weren't really trying to bend anybody's thinking. You're just showing you too can do this little trick.
Sure.
And make all of these things sound better than you imagine that they could sound without hardly any effort at all, which
But
really
isn't that wonderful? I mean, that's kind of the whole thing behind, what we're all trying to do via YouTube and all of these outlets is, just kind of share, like Michael's saying, the hot sauce or the secret sauce or, the little tricks and tips that we've all,
well, the beauty of it is that the lineage of running the power station like that goes way back to the beginning of the rack days when you slaved ahead into a load and then use that as a preamp through effects into a power amp into speakers to try to make a sophisticated rig like that sound like an amp.
Yeah.
Sound just like I wanted to sound like an amp.
Well, an amp, but an amp that has been processed and everything's kind of mastered and on the record already, right? So we have all of our effects and clean stuff. It's not the Dark Ages Flintstone version of guitar amplification. There's a whole new paradigm of the whole thing is done.
Well, see, but that period, that thing that like all sort of ties into what the goal at the time was, and there's different people have different perspective on what that goal was and what the output, the end result of that quest was. And we have a little clip of Dave Friedman's take on that.
Yeah, I have a couple clips here. I'm just going to play them back to back because it's kind of setting up, sort of what we're talking about here.
Okay.
So this is from our friends at Tone Talk, of course. Awesome stuff. And I'll just go ahead and play it now. So
I get asked a lot because people see, this rack, this behemoth behind me, and they ask me which power amp are you playing through, and I have actually eight stereo power amps back here. And people, well, what is the best one? I mean, what separates one from another? I mean, it's not just power tubes. It could be, I think you hit on the nail on the head by saying that it's flavoring. Like all the VHTs have a flavor to them that's unique to VHT. All the Mesas have a flavor that's unique to Mesa. So if you like that flavor, that's the thing you need to look at. But it's hard to tell. That's the hardest part about this whole gear thing.
It's sort of a filter, all the different power amps are sort of a filter. What the thing was at the time when we were doing these racks, what we really wanted was in a 4-space, 2-space something. We just wanted 2 Marshall power sections in a box. That's what we really wanted. And no one ever did it.
Which begs the question, why?
Yeah. Well,
and let's talk about that. First of all, sorry to burst your bubble, Ken McMahon, but the Holdsworth harness was not the first. There are several things that came before that, but the Holdsworth harness one, and I talked to Holdsworth about this, and he had an engineering background, and his father had an engineering background, so he was one of those guys that actually knew of once he spoke, and so he was knowledgeable in that regard, and he was experimenting with stuff like that, and he came up with some pretty cool ideas. But he wasn't the first to do that. He probably embellished the idea a little bit, but he was not the first. Anyway, so number one, the power amp being a filter. So this is sort of like a point counterpoint to Dave Friedman. And so just for fun, this is probably too way back for a lot of you guys, but Saturday Night Live had this funny skit called Point Counterpoint, and was Dan Aykroyd and who was the girl that played played counterpoint to him? Jane
Curtin.
Jane Curtin.
Yeah.
And so she would make her point, and then Aykroyd would do the counterpoint. He would start out, Jane, you ignorant slut. So, Dave, you ignorant slut.
Dave.
and we're buddies, so I can get away with that. All right. He's the one that sent me the middle finger emoji and said, "Fuck you for building a better power station" when the PS100 came out. So that's the kind of relationship we have, just so you know.
And Dave's the man. Dave's the man.
And yeah, sweet guy. And some pretty amazing ears on him as well. And he knows what he hears, and he knows what he likes, and he likes what he hears, and he does what makes him happy, which is all you can ask of somebody that's designing something or building something for other players to play through. He knows what he's trying to accomplish, and there's a lot of people that glom onto that because that's what they're trying to get to. And that's where he's kind of coming from, which is, hey, you know, all everybody wanted was X, what he said. So let's first talk about the power amp being a filter. And I think I'm just going to expand on that and refine it a little bit, because what he's really saying is, think of the power amp as having a certain personality, and each different power amp imparts a different personality to the sound. Now, Fender amp has a personality. Is it because it has 6L6s in it? Partly, but that's not really all of it. That's just a small part. It has transformers. It has tone stacks. It has a circuit board layout. It has a reverb circuit. It has all kinds of things in the circuitry that impact how it works and behaves. And that's what gives it its personality. But just the power amp section alone is not that far removed from the power circuitry that's used in a Marshall, or that's used in a Mesa, or that's used in lots of other amplifiers. So how they share personality traits and how they differ has more to do with the execution, the kind of parts that get used, than necessarily is it a Fender voicing because it's got 6L6s, or a Marshall voicing because it's got EL34s. That's just
that's reductionist and overly simplistic, I'm sure.
Thank you very much. I like it when you use those big words that I can't think of at the moment.
It's the whine.
Well, keep whining.
50-cent words.
Just keep on whining. I love it when you whine. So the behavior of the transformers can sometimes just be just coincidental. In the case of the Fender designs, they had originally contracted a subcontract manufacturer to design amplifier circuits for them, Western Electric. So when there's a company that makes a product, and you need something based on the expertise that company is known for, and you can pay them to provide you with some of their expertise, you do that. You don't have to go reinvent the wheel every time. Sure. We do that sometimes. Every manufacturer does that. You go out to, these guys make this module. That's like Class D now. You can just go get the off-the-shelf Class D module and just build a preamp around it, and you've got an amp that's 200 watts and weighs 5 pounds. So then as things progress, Tinker Leo goes in, and he's just messing about and sort of wrapping his mind around how these things work and behave. And he's also got a tech guy there in the person of Tom. I'm gonna blank on his name. Somebody will help out with that. The guy at Fender that had some engineering background, that I think he went on to work for Music Man after Fender. Anyway, so he had some electronic expertise, and he and Leo worked together to evolve the original Western Electric designs into newer models that became the blackface amps and so on and so forth. So those guys were operating from a starting point of having some expertise behind it. The transformers were designed specifically; they were purpose. But Tom Walker, thank you, Kelly. See, I don't really have to have that many brains because we've got so many people that have
That's awesome. Every time we can't figure something out, you guys find it. That's beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, it's quite wonderful. So it's great to have. So thanks. Plus, I just get tongue-tied. It's for all the yakking that I do get tongue-tied once in a while when I'm trying to think of a person's name, and I don't want to get it wrong because these people are like they're the pioneers, they're the giants in the industry that underscore everything that we do. So they need to be sort of memorialized. Like David Reeves and so on. And I'm perfectly happy to do that, perform that service. Anyway, so they were operating from a foundation of expertise and engineering foundation where they knew what the power transformers were supposed to do. They weren't buying an off-the-shelf power transformer from a transformer supplier and then applying an amplifier to it. They were going to a transformer manufacturer and saying, we need a secondary at this voltage and another secondary at this voltage and this many amps and a third secondary at this voltage and this many amps and blah blah blah, and the manufacturer would do that. But they had to know what they were doing to do that. And the same with the output transformer. We need a load line here, we need the plate-to-plate impedance of X, and the transformer company had the skill to translate that data into the new output transformer design. Not only the design, but the way the transformer was manufactured, how the winds were layered on top of each other, and how many layers were used. And in that way, it's very similar to how guitar pickups are produced. How many turns of wire they have, what the wire resistance is, and what the diameter of the wire is one thing, but how the pickup is wound and the shape of the bobbin and the style of the magnets used, they all have an impact. And those are the things that most people don't talk about because they don't know anything about it.
Right.
I'm going the long way around on discussing that because what Marshall was doing was just the opposite. They were taking a Fender amplifier and saying, the Fenders are too expensive here, we'll make some locally. Where do we get a transformer? Where do we get a power transformer? Where do we get an output transformer? Where do we get some tubes? 6L6s are hard to get here, but
that's what I thought. Yeah, bingo.
These things called EL34s because we're in England and EL34s, and we've got General Electric here, which is the division of General Electric in England at the time, which was GEC, General Electric Corporation. That's why the British GEC tubes are actually GE. It's almost like a franchise. They're making tubes under the GEC brand, but they're making them their way.
BBC, GEC.
Yeah. They're making them their way for their reasons. And of course, tube technology and development of tube technology in the US is proceeding much faster than it is in the UK because the UK is still digging themselves out after World War II. We're like going, blah, blah, blah. We need industrial tubes. We need industrial power amplifiers for research. So more specialized tube designs are coming out of the US and they're ahead of the UK. So the tubes that are available a lot of it is military surplus. So the Marshalls that started coming out were made from military surplus parts that they could scavenge or electronics manufacturing surplus of one type or another. And then what Marshall proceeded to do was to refine how to produce those things profitably. And that's why when they really got the designs refined, like between 68 and 70, then you started seeing things change that had less to do with product development and refinement and more about cost effectiveness.
Wait, and this was around what time?
70, 71, 72.
Oh, so like the CBS era when the beam counters were running things.
Seeing the plate voltages and Marshalls go down.
Sure.
Why would the plate voltage go down? Well, because the EL34s weren't all that reliable. So if they lower the plate voltage, if they lowered the plate voltage, then the tubes would last longer and they wouldn't fail as easily, right? So there's a practical reason there. And then you start hearing the mid-range quality of the JMP change and get a little bit more scoop sounding. Gee, why would they do that? Oh, they were working with Hendrix and Hendrix wanted that. No, wrong. No, they went from they went from from the way they wound the transformer, which was paper wound, to what was called stick winding or scatter winding. And the way it works is this. On a machine, you have a bobbin. But if you don't have a bobbin, you start with a layer of paper.
Okay.
So wrap paper around the stick, which is what the transformer is, which is going to be spinning. A machine is going to spin this square axle called the stick.
Mm-hmm.
And you'd wrap a wrap of insulating paper around the stick, and that would be the insulation of the first layer of wire. So you'd wind the wire on that layer from end to end, have a nice flat, smooth layer. Then you'd wrap another layer of paper, and then you'd go wind another layer of wind on top of that. So what the paper did was it made sure that the layers of wire were evenly distributed.
Okay.
Right? And that took time.
I was going to ask, I wonder how long it took to wind a complete transformer.
It's time consuming. It usually adds about 20 to 30% to the cost of the transformer to do it that way.
Okay.
And that's why they're not really used so much in guitar amplifier design. We use tape and we use paper in different applications.
All part of the recipe for
there's the right time to use one and there's the right time to use another.
Interesting.
But what we never do is scatterwind. Scatterwind is where you just spin the bobbin and just like the wire lands where it lands, and so the layers are all interspersed and they're like down. Some of the wires are on top of other wires, and some of the wires are in between other wires. So there's no consistency from layer to layer. It's just they're wound. The wire is just all bundled up.
It's more efficient to do it that way.
It's a hell of a lot faster, but it's also less well insulated. So when you use it with an attenuator, it's more likely that transformer is going to arc, and that's why in the mid to late 70s, Marshall disavowed the use of attenuators because they wouldn't warranty their transformers because it would be too easy for those transformers to arc under those conditions.
I see.
But you saw those things. You saw them reduce the number of filter capacitors. They had too many in the beginning anyway. So they figured that out that, hey, we don't really need that many filter capacitors. So they could remove some, save some costs. And that's what you saw from the mid 70s on. You saw this sort of progressive reduction of cost in producing these amps, which, there's a logic to that. And it certainly makes economic sense. There's different ways to approach it. You always saw that sort of in evidence in Marshall development. Whereas with Fender, you kept seeing technological development and evolvement of the designs, like going from the tweed to the blackface, and from the blackface to the silverface, and then from the silverface they tried solid state for a while, and that didn't work so well. So they went back and then they rethought it and they did more tube stuff, and then they tried solid state again in the 80s, and and
then they decided guitar players just want the stuff that was happening back in the the genesis phase of that music.
I think ultimately what Fender makes a very intelligent no, scatterwind is not bullshit. I'm speaking from manufacturing experience here, but okay, we can debate that another time. What you see Fender doing is recognizing the layering of the partitioning of the marketplace.
Sure. Yeah.
This segment of the market are more concerned about price and weight and convenience and affordability. And this segment of the market is more concerned about quality or detail or adherence to old design values or something like that. So they partition it out so that they can make stuff for the entry level market, and they can make stuff for the pro. And
so we'll have the custom shop, and then we'll have the
they understand that all customers aren't the same customer, and that's an intelligent assessment for a manufacturer to make. And Marshall, did the same thing eventually.
Mm-hmm.
But I think Fender has done it more successfully because I think they understood that development and innovation is a really key part of moving things forward. And Jim Marshall is pretty legendary for like not wanting to go off script. I mean, people were known to like leave the company because they felt constrained by the ability to innovate, and give rise to that's better said. It's inconsistent, which was my whole point. The gave rise to Black Star. They were frustrated Marshall guys, and when we got all these great ideas that you guys won't listen to, all right, we're going to go make our own little company and we'll use those ideas, and voila, that's progress, right?
Yeah.
So it looks like we got way off script again, but going back to the power amp rack thing and the rack thing, there's these constants that you just cannot get away from. And one of them is that a solid state amp, no matter what class or form it takes, is a different animal than a tube amp in every respect. In how they produce power, in the components that are used in the power supply, and how those parts of the whole work together, and what they're intended to be, what job they are intended to do, and how that job is intended to be done. It's a different philosophical approach than how tube amps operate. Tube amps operate the way they operate, and you can refine them, and we've worked on refining tube amp design for decades. And you can refine them as much as you want, but in order to get them to sound and behave the way musicians are familiar with and responsive to and appreciate, they don't need, the power supplies don't need to be purer and cleaner and stiffer. It's just not needed.
You're gonna engineer out all the funk, and then people are gonna go, wait a minute, this isn't what I signed up for.
And I have participated in that. I've tried that. I've tried it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is great. There's no more flub. There's no more ghost notes in there. There's no more when you like lay into it. It's right there. It's bam. It's blah 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 blah. And check this out. You hand the guitar player to a guy, and he goes, "This thing is stiff and cold as my ex-girlfriend."
Yeah.
And you just like, you're taken aback. You go, wait a minute, I just fixed all the problems. It's like, you fix this thing to death. Just like take it out in the backyard and bury it. It's dead. And
there are certain guitar builders who did that too. It was kind of like, let's build a better Strat. And in my taste, it kind of felt like, man, this thing is perfect, and I don't want to play it.
Yeah.
Give me back that thing that's not quite together, but it has all the funk.
Yeah, and you perfected it to death.
Yeah. You perfected it to death.
Yeah. So going back to Mike Nielsen and his module experiment today, what he did was he used the power station to introduce power amp personality, not just to use the power amp section of the PS2 as a power amp to amplify the level of the module, but he used the trick that we created in the PS2, which is the self attenuation mode, to take the output of the power station, feed it back into its own reactive load, and use the reactive load to modify the behavior of the power amp, so that when you hit it with the sound coming from the preamp, it emulates the behavior of a cranked amp, which is kind of the opposite of what you're trying to do with the power station. You're trying to keep it, transparent, and you're trying to keep it so that it doesn't color the sound too much, because you want to maintain the sound of the amp that you're loading to attenuate it down to a usable volume. So in one sense, the Power Station 2 and the Power Station 100 are designed to be neutral and only introduce enough of familiar guitar power amp artifacts to give it a realistic feel when you play. The dynamic sort of touch sensitivity stuff under your fingers when you play the strings on the guitar. So that kind of thing. So using the Power Station in that way, self-attenuating it to force the power amp into saturation, it's still a fairly clean power amp. So when you max it out, it isn't sounding fizzy because it isn't distorting like a typical guitar power amp does, where it's non-linear, it can be a little buzzy on top, or the top half of the wave clips faster than the bottom half of the wave, which sort of imparts a slightly nasal sort of personality to the tone. Those are tonal artifacts that you can actually hear. In the Power Station, it doesn't do that. When it clips, both the top and bottom of the waveform of the power amp clip at the same time, and that's what's called linear clipping, or symmetrical clipping. The idea is just that when you run up the output power to its maximum, to the rails, the next thing that happens is it just starts compressing. And that's what you're hearing in the Nielsen video with those Synergy preamps, is you're hearing the chewiness and the compression of the PS2 because he was forcing it to do that. And then he was using the reactive load part to modify how the power amp was reacting to the load so that you could emphasize the sparkly stuff on the top and the resonant peak on the bottom, which is what the reactive load does. And then you can use the presence and depth to sort of fine tune that, add a little icing or smooth it out a little bit. So he's using the Power Station exactly the opposite reason that it was designed for, but that sort of was intended to be available there because it's an important aspect of playing a guitar amp loud but quiet, but getting it not only to sound like it does when it's loud, but behave like
feel
it's
that way
loud when it's quiet. And
right.
Those are two entirely different tasks. And those are all generated by the desire from the 80s and 90s to use a head as a preamp, load it down, send that signal into effects, and then send it into the power amp. And different power amps behave different ways, which Dave Friedman sort of characterized as sort of a filter, but what we characterize as more of a personality trait. And the proposition that what everybody really wanted was just 200 watt Marshall circuits on a chassis in a box that you could rack mount. And the problem with that proposition is that it only works for the Marshall sound.
Right. And
so what happens when you're trying to play clean? What happens when you're trying to use, you have a rack with a head and this is what we were doing in the early 90s, is you would use a head under load as a preamp, but you also had a couple preamps in the rack, and you would switch from the loaded head to a Soldano preamp, a Kasha preamp, or whatever else was available for a different sonic quality and a different sonic end result.
Right.
So in that scenario, you didn't want it to sound like a Marshall. You wanted it to sound like a Fender, or you wanted it to sound like something new, or you wanted it to sound like a Mesa, or again,
or just good,
or just good, right?
Just good.
So the first order of business is to decide what is really the role of the power amp. And that leads to how do you configure the power amp. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the very first 100 2150s were built differently than the next production. And that was in direct reaction to the feedback that we got from players. We like the 2150, but it's got this sort of ratty quality that we like, but I want to be able to have it so that it doesn't have that quality when I don't want it.
Oh, that's
and so then I think in that not in the clip of that Tone Talk show that you played, but within that conversation, Dave had mentioned that why didn't the other manufacturers just use like a long tail pair phase inverter and do it that way, blah, 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 blah. And the reason is, well, first you have to ask the question, why didn't Marshall do it? Why didn't Mesa Boogie do it? Why didn't we do it? Why didn't anybody do it? The only person that actually really did that was Mike Soldano. He made a power amp, a rack mount power amp that had a long tail pair, and it was basically a 6L6 version of a Marshall power amp.
Okay.
And why didn't he sell a ton of them? Because they were monoblocks. So that was 8 rack spaces of 2 100-watt chassis.
Wow.
And certainly nobody wanted that much, cartage headache. There was a point where people bought some of those and made those. You had 2 18-space racks then of stuff, and it got to be like the refrigerator wars period, but that didn't last very long because it was just super expensive and
it's unsustainable.
And it was unsustainable, right?
Yeah.
So, but the other part of it was a long tail pair by itself doesn't have the headroom to drive power tubes to produce that much power and headroom to stay out of the way when you wanted it to.
Okay, that's the key right there.
That's the key right there. And why didn't any other manufacturer do that topology? Because they all recognize that same thing. We need it to sound like a credible guitar-based power amp voicing when we want it to, but we want it out of the way when we don't want it to be so intrusive that it's in the way when we're trying to not do that.
Right.
And that is basically when people were using preamps and they wanted that extra little character. Well, what's in a way that we can emulate that character? I know. We'll take a head and put it under load, and that will be the preamp. And then when we want that sound, the head is doing that and imparting that personality. And then we go back to the power amp, and still you need you don't want more of that. You already created it.
No. Because
but the difficulty is that without a reactive load, the head that you use as a preamp would only do that to a certain degree. And then it would be constrained by the fact that it was a purely resistive load and not reactive. Yeah. And there were early attempts at reactive loads. And as one of our guys mentioned, Holsworth was experimenting with that. Andy Marshall came out with the hot plate, which is advertised as reactive, but it was only reactive up to a point. And in some cases, the reactive behavior of it actually acted in reverse of what you wanted it to do. And that caused some problems. So it was a solution. It was a partial solution. And I bought one and I used it. Yeah. But, and Palmer made one.
Yeah.
And they made an early one that sounded really good. And then they made one that had more knobs and switches and it was more flexible. And everybody said that didn't sound as good.
Right. Yeah.
I had both of them.
Yeah.
And the first one did have more personality.
I had the first one.
And the second one was more usable. And I went back and forth and I used them both at gigs and I would switch back and forth between them. And my biggest memory of the experience of doing that was the original one that everybody said sounded good. When I used that one, I got this raging headache.
Oh, huh.
That,
I could see that
I didn't know where it was coming from. But at the end of the gig, I just had what felt like a migraine. I don't get migraines, but it felt like this ice picks going into my eyes. And I'm like,
yeah,
what the hell is that? And the next gig, I used the other one and it wasn't quite as responsive and all that. Yeah, sure. But at the end of the gig, I felt fine. I was like, well, maybe I drank something weird. So the next rehearsal, I used the first one again, headache back again, raging, just mind-blowing headache, just head-splitting headache. And there was something in that first Palmer unit that had some kind of bizarre phase shift that just gave me a massive headache that the later one didn't do. And so what I did was I took the GP3 preamp and I put a couple of effects in there. I had a couple of TC things, a 2290 and and they had this delay called an M1 or something like that. I forget what it was.
Yeah.
And then I had a 252 power amp.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had another power amp. And
you were out of hand, man.
Well, what I did was the 252, I had the left channel plugged into the Palmer.
Okay.
And run in Class A B mode.
Okay.
And set up just to the point of
wait, which Palmer?
The second one.
The second one, yeah, okay.
And the PG04, I think it was called. And so I just set the power amp just to where it would clip when you really laid into it, so that it would drive that. And then the other channel I had set at Class A mode, so the tubes would run hotter, and I fed that into the hot plate. So I had this all built into a rack. So what I was doing is I was using the two channels of the 252 power amps into two different kinds of loads that weren't, either one of them were really the ideal reactive load kind of behavior, but between the two of them, I could fake them into behaving the way I wanted to together. And then I took the outputs of those and ran those into the line-ins of a classic power amp to power the speakers.
Wow.
And I took that
to a lot of work, Steve. That's a lot of work.
I took that to a gig and I played that. And
how long were you on stage total?
45 minutes. Yeah.
Dude.
Yeah.
But way lazy.
Boy, was it. Page Hamilton just happened to be in town, and he came down to that show, and he came up to me and he says, usually your sound is pretty good, and I sort of get where you're going with it, but I always feel it needs something. But tonight, the tone you had, I just basically wanted to go up on stage and tear up all your gear and kick it off the stage because it sounded so good that you pissed me off. And I was like, wow. It was really magnificent, but holy shit, was it a lot of work. And I brought that to another show one time. It was a club that held 100 people. It was insanity. But the people that I was playing with, the drummer was a freak for recording stuff, and he had a really nice mic, and he had a little sidecar that he brought to the gig with him.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
And he fed that into a little portable hard drive. And a few years ago, he sent me a CD of that. Hey, I found a copy of this, and I played it on the stereo, and I'm like, I was in the other room and I thought my wife had put on a live Cream record or something. And I went, who's that? And she came out and she's like looking, who do you think it is? I go, I don't know, but that guitar sound is amazing. And I came in and she's playing a CD from this guy. And I'm like, oh my God, that sounds phenomenal. But who in their right mind would carry a thing like that? But going back to the power amps having personalities, yeah. The 2150 had a personality, and the classic had a different personality, had different tubes, and the power supply was configured slightly differently, but it was meant to add some juice, but not too much.
Yeah.
And the 2150 was meant to add a little less and be more accurate sounding, because the people that were using those were using more high gain in the upfront preamp, kind of overdrive kind of thing anyway. And they wanted more articulation and to play big chords and have all the chords in the note played accurately. Yeah. And then Mesa had they didn't have the 290 and the 5050 out yet. They were still in the Coliseum and whatever the bigger power amps that they were making at the time, which were not as musical sounding, and they didn't really have much versatility, but they had, pretty hefty low end, which people like. And I know that's what really made them popular with people. But also Randall Smith did come up to me at an AM show and kind of give me grief for, knocking a hole in his power amp sales. And I was just like, I was still at the stage where I wasn't really sure if I was in the right business.
No kidding. Wow.
I was still kind of experimenting and kind of getting away with murder. Wow, I just know enough to be dangerous.
Yeah.
And I'm selling these power amps, and here I've got somebody that I respect, a major producer, is telling me that I'm doing damage to his sales of a particular product line, and I kind of felt bad. I'm like, I don't know what I did. I just accidentally, sorry. And it was pretty funny. He thought I was putting on an act. And,
oh, really?
Yeah,
oh man.
Yeah, he thought I was just kind of goofing on him, and he realized later that I wasn't, but we've always been buddies, so that phase passed. So, and I had that little feather in my cap, but
see, I always thought the whole thing was that, the rack power amps you needed to split the difference. You needed to look at, either the preamp or the loaded, the head that's running into the dummy load. You're treating that as kind of your, your bedrock tone. And of course you wanted the power amp to impart a little bit of sauce, but it's also a platform for all of these, these studio effect modules that you've got in the rack, which almost, demand more of the hi-fi approach to reproduce that. So the idea of running that stuff into a traditional, Marshall or super colored power amp thing never made sense to me. So I thought you guys, the people who were really building for that market, it's kind of like, like I said, you're kind of on a high wire act, kind of trying to balance between those things. You can't go full on, ripping Marshall power section. That makes no sense for the effects stuff that was the du jour of the day.
Well, let's unpack what Friedman was saying a little bit, and then it'll start to make more sense. Because what he's essentially saying is what guitar players want out of a sophisticated rig is to sound just like their regular rig, only with the sophistication they want added without the compromise of it not being not being sophisticated. In other words,
good luck.
And he said this. He said when he first started building racks, and we all experienced that same thing. And Bradshaw did, and I did. When we would bring innovative solutions to guitar players that were progressive thinking players, that you mistake that because they're thinking along those lines, that they're comprehending what the outcome of their thought process would be, and they're not. And Friedman would tell you that, yeah, I build this really sophisticated rack for this guy, and he comes in, you hand him the guitar, and you plug him in, and he just looks at it, and he just like goes deer in the headlights. Like, oh my God, what have I done? And he recounts the story of showing Lukather where to plug the guitar into the rack, because otherwise, what do I do now?
Yeah,
and a lot of people react to that. They think, I do the same thing. I think it would be great if I had blah 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 blah, and then you do it, and then you go, oh, I see why nobody's done it. It's unworkable, or it's unworkable to the extent that I've thought it through this far.
Yeah.
So now I have to go look at what's what is at the root of the unworkability of it, and then try to solve that puzzle.
Right.
And that's what's been going on for the last 30 years, starting from taking a preamp, and to make it sound like a head going into a cabinet, I took a preamp, took the output, plugged it into a classic power amp, and plugged both outputs of the classic power amp into dummy loads, and then took those outputs at line level and plugged them into another classic power amp and put dummy loads on the second classic power amp and ran that up so that it was getting a crank sound, and then taking a line out of that, putting it through a reverb, and then output of the reverb into a 2150 and out to 2 412 caps. So now we've got the preamp going into 3 power amps in series. 2 of them are slaved into each other, and then the third one is actually the power amp that's driving the speakers. And oh my God, talk about, when it's winter and you want to be warm, and so you put like the quilt and the blanket, and then the other little
the thermal underwear,
and all of that, and so you have these layers of comfort and sweetness and warmth, and you go, this is great. It only weighs 375 pounds and costs $8,000, but people would come in into the factory, like really good place. Like Landau would walk in, or different Joey Brasler from making Who's Not Fender, and they would just like fight over the guitar to play through it, and they would just play one chord, and you could see the hair on their arms stand up. And they just go, "That's insane. It's unworkable. I know, but it's insane." And you had to do in the insane things in order to extrapolate what it is that you understood from the behavior of those things working in that insane sort of configuration, and then try to figure out how to do it in the practical world. And so when the Power Station came out, we would get, "Where have you been for the last 40 years?" I was like, working towards this moment. Thank you very much. So we finally get to the point where as Mike Nielsen demonstrated, where we can take a preamp and put it into a power amp and force the power amp to behave like a raging amp, and then take that, and he went directly into a DAW, which would be the same thing as going into another clean power amp into speakers.
Sure.
And then the subject comes up, well, in those days there was the H&H power amp, which was solid state. And again, it goes back to so there's a resurgence of interest in racks. And what's driving that?
I think it's, a lot of people, probably my age-ish, who grew up. I think Michael actually has posted a lot of this stuff, looking at old guitar magazines. And, you're a teenager looking at this stuff, and all of your heroes are playing through this stuff, and you've got no money. Maybe you got a job and you can afford to buy strings, and you're just looking at this stuff like, maybe someday I can have a rack. I remember myself, I would, design what was going to be in my rack. Of course, I never had one like that, but I think, it's just that kind of thing, that happens with every generation. You get to a point where you have enough bread where you're like, you know what? I can actually go back and buy some of that stuff that I wanted, that I could never afford. And, let's go ahead and do it and see what it's like, see what this is about. So I think that's a lot of what's driving it, because before that, actually coming out of the rack era, it was kind of like going back to a lot of the minimalist stuff, that was, if you look at it, 20, 30 years, what was happening with these players when they were a kid? It's like, well, I want to do that now. And that kind of drives the trend. So I think that's really what it is. It's a lot of nostalgia, and also kind of just like cycling through things like, okay, we're tired of what the paradigm has been. Let's kind of what's left. Oh yeah. That we decided it was terrible to do,
and in retrospect,
5 years ago.
And in retrospect, what's driving the interest is the stuff that did sound good, that you'd like to go. That's
the
good.
Records too, right?
And time filters out all the shit product that was out at that time that didn't sound good, that fell off the radar. So you don't think, hey, what'd be really great is to get that preamp that really sucked, that everybody hated. So you don't think that way. You just think about the good sounding record, or the good sounding live gig that somebody did that's on record, or that you heard live that sounded amazing, and that they used certain gear to do that.
Yeah.
But Kelly makes a good point. He thinks that that's driven by guys not using amp at all at gigs and running preamps and modelers direct and all that. And there's legitimacy to that too, because once you do that, it's the same thing in the rack era that drove people back to the simplistic amp era, which was the rack revolution didn't deliver on the promise of plugging straight into a Marshall half stack and having all the bells and whistles at the same time. It was an impossible ask,
right?
And it was impossible to deliver. And so when everybody realized that, okay, that's never going to really happen. It's not organic anymore. It sounds processed. And of course, a lot of the bands that were using rigs like that, their records were getting more sophisticated and more produced and sounding more corporate processed, as they used to say, and all of that. And of course, Stevie Ray Vaughan comes out and just sort of lays waste to that whole mentality. Here, you plug a Strat into an amp, and you turn it all the way up, and you drink a half a bottle of whiskey, and you just let hell.
Yeah. And there were always guys kind of getting through doing.
Then you hear that really organic, open, woody sound that has been missing for the last 10 years, and go.
Well, I remember my own personal story with that. You know, I had built my little rack. You know, I had a Mesa rack. I had the 290 power amp. I think I was running the tri-axis preamp at that point that had followed the JMP1. I forget what effects I had in there. I was running a stereo rig. It was, glorious. And I remember coming into the store that I taught in, and my buddy said, "Hey, you should check out, what I got going over here. I'm running." It was he had bought one of those, not the Hot Rod Deluxe, but it was the Tweed Fender Deluxe that came out in the 90s. It was the first, what did they call it? I think it was just a Deluxe, but it was a Tweed 112 amp, had 2 channels, but we just ran it clean with 1 Boss pedal and 1 delay. You said you got to play this thing.
Horrible, so that's why you only use the clean channel.
Oh, right, exactly. But I remember rolling my eyes like, dude, I have this rack, man, in the back room. Like, that's where it's at. He's like, no, come up and play this thing. And I did. And I'm not kidding. I went on, I started parting out my rack the next day. Like, forget it, man. Like, it was. Now, this is the truth. I didn't know what the hell I was doing back then. So I might have been, I didn't know how to pull all the potential out of that rack that was probably available. But there was so much more, cojones, and just like, oh, this is easy. 2 pedals, this little combo amp and my guitar, and I'm ready to roll. And this is killing. I love it. It feels amazing. It's easy. I'm going back to that.
But there was a lot of things going on at the same time, like guitars with really brittle bodies and pickups that were overwound to the point of silliness. And
yeah, I never got into that kind of thing.
And of course, if you wanted to use 112 cab, a pair of 112 or 212 cabs instead of a 412 cabs, you didn't have to drag around a 412 cab. You couldn't get away with greenbacks. You just couldn't use them. They couldn't handle the power. So you had to have different speakers, and for every problem there's a solution, and for every solution there's a compromise. And the more you add to the pile, the more compromise you incorporate into it, and the more people try to come up with novel but completely ill-fated methods of executing on a solution. And there was one great one. I forget the name of the company, but they came up with the idea for a pickup that had no personality.
That was the point?
Yeah.
Like, oh, okay, yeah.
The pickup had no. They designed it so that the resonant peaks of the pickups and the characteristic tonal qualities of the pickup. That's why we love a PAF, or why we love
let's get rid of all that.
A 68 tele pickup. We take all that out.
Yeah.
And then you run it into this programmable EQ.
Oh.
And then we provide you with the factory patches for the EQ. The company that made the EQ didn't come up with this idea. Somebody else did.
Okay.
But they used this EQ because it was a programmable stereographic. And they spent hours and hours and hours listening to different guitars and programming the EQ, programming the pickups, peaks and dips into the EQ, so that you use a flat pickup and plug into the preamp and have that go into the EQ, and the EQ would change the sound to match supposedly the pickups that we're using. The only problem is, first of all, it wasn't the pickup that was doing any changing, and the pickup is going to the preamp and creating all the distortion first, and then going to an EQ, and then going to the processor. So the EQ was EQing what the preamp was doing, not just the pickup. And I mean, it was completely wrong-headed and silly, but
someone had to do it.
But someone had to do it, and someone had to sell it, and they went to NAMM and they were selling the concept, and people were going, "Oh, it makes a lot of sense," because a lot of that stuff was new and fresh and strange and progressive, and you had to go. Somebody thought of it and spent the time to develop, and maybe they've got it figured out, and you would try it and go, "Yeah, I can sort of see how that would work." But then when you would go back and just plug into a take a Strat and plug into a Tweed bass bin, you would just like go, what just happened?
Yeah.
I just wait a minute. Let me get the hook out of my mouth.
Yeah. But there's okay. So I think there's looking at these sorts of things from the standpoint of good tone or traditionally good tone. But there's also like I was thinking when we were talking about the Palmer stuff. I remember when I had my Palmer, it was the first version, I would actually use it on purpose, not live, but in the studio, because I had this thing that it imparted that it just sounded different. Like everything that I would run it through, it had this thing. And I would get these ideas. Oh, yeah, I need to run my, whatever amp through the Palmer for this part. And it wasn't like this is, godlike tone. It was just something that would sit in the mix in a particular way. And it's kind of so, I guess what I'm getting at is there are unintended outcomes or uses for particular things outside of the, what most of us would commonly refer to it, like the Holy Grail kind of tone stuff. There's also stuff that maybe kind of sounds like ass on its own, but it has its place, or the guitar that feels sterile or whatever. Yeah, I keep that thing around because every once in a while there's a particular kind of part that I need to lay down that this sterile guitar that I'd never want to play on stage can do like no other guitar.
People who are creative,
like I've thought about this a lot too. Talking about the rack stuff, I went through a period probably 5 years ago where and this is going to date me, but I went back and I bought a bunch of Ibanez RG guitars because that was the thing when I started playing. I started playing on a Strat, but then the next thing that I was like, oh, those Ibanez guitars with the super thin neck, the wizard neck, and the edge tremolo. And I just got it in my head, like I want to see what those are about again. They were my dream guitars at one point. And so I bought a handful of them, brought them home, and man, these things do not compare to my normal working instruments. But I was playing them through the kind of rig that I would play through today, which is not what I would have been using in the 90s. But what I thought was, all these guitars are really thin on the bottom. They don't have a lot of meat. They don't have a lot of harmonic content. But man, you know what? They actually really work well with a particular kind of high gain, super focused thing. Like you can't really play certain kinds of music that really sits well on one of these Ibanez RGs. You can't really play that on, my historic Les Paul or whatever that has, kicking all this harmonic content, big, fat, wonderful singing notes. Like the Ibanez doesn't do that, but it does this other thing. If I was going to play 90s thrash again, that's the guitar that I would want because that's the right tool for that job. And its shortcomings are actually its strengths for that particular type of music, right?
Well, you're talking as a guitarist that is creating music and thinking about creating music. And you're evolving as a musician, as an artist. And when we were coming up with these ideas in the 80s and 90s, and then refining them in the 2000s and coming back around full circle now, what we're doing is we're not going back and revisiting all the old junk to make it over again.
Right.
We're incorporating what we've learned to evolve the ideas that make these things really work in the same way. At the same time, guys like you are evolving their playing and their philosophy of playing and their approach to their art and growing as musicians. And everybody does. Buzzy Featon does. Steve Lukather does. Steve Vai does. Paige Hamilton does. Anybody that you talk to will tell you that they're not trying to be what they were 20 years ago. I talked to John Shanks when he was working on the last Van Halen album, and he was trying to get Eddie to use the old formula, and Eddie was going, man, I just don't play like that anymore, you know. And there's a truth in there that everybody is moving along.
Mm-hmm.
And what you think about as in terms of the revival of the old stuff, you want the revival of the best part of the old stuff. And you sort of make the assumption, just like players made the assumption that if I had all this stuff, it would basically sound like my JMP half-stack crank, but with all the bells and whistles that I wanted added into it. That never really panned out. So what you have done in listening today and going, that's what you should have done all along. And what I could be thinking in my own mind is, if I was the player then that I am now, that's what I would have been asking for then, maybe at that time. Mm-hmm. But I wasn't them. I wasn't that person then, and they weren't that person then. Mm-hmm. You are who you are now, and what we're doing in evolving the stuff that we develop and the things that we think about and the stuff that we've learned from the past. We're refining what we're doing now, incorporating those things into the stew, and you're going, yeah, that's what I was looking for. Oh, yeah, well, that's what we've been looking for too. Everybody's on this journey of refinement and not just trying to recreate what you were doing 30 years ago, but looking at yourself as having grown from point A to point B. And now you actually have sort of like the talent and the skill and the artistic vision to actually execute on what sort of seminal thoughts you had of that concept at that time, but now you're actually there and can utilize it. And you know who's a great example of that is David Torn. He's like, he went from this sort of really progressive music with these really sort of, the esoteric tools of the time that were kind of stiff and electronic, and the headstockless guitars. And
he using the Pierce? He
used the Pierce amp and all that. He was exploring then.
Mm-hmm.
And you listen to him.
Phenomenal then. I love that stuff.
Yeah, you love that stuff then, but you listen to him now, and what you hear in his playing is you hear the gospel, you hear the progressive jazz, you hear the noise artist, and you hear the bluegrass, and you hear all of it. You hear the Eastern tonalities, the mm-hmm. Eastern scales that he's sort of incorporated into his style. You hear it all at the same time, and mm-hmm. you're just in awe that he's got a guitar with a wang bar and no pick, and his fingernails plugged into a fuzz face clone, and then into either a Sound City, which is a pretty straight ahead clean amp that you have to crank, or a Deliverance, which he uses it for some overdrive, but mostly he cranks that into a attenuator too, just to get the power amp mojo, which is a very rudimentary setup, but he's progressed light years, and what he brings to his music when he plays is just an emotional, almost religious experience of a guy that can take those basic tools and just show you a whole new universe of sonic architecture that just is mind-blowing, and it's just coming right off the top of his head.
I remember I was standing around when he was playing. He kind of went into his own world playing, and I was just standing right there, and I was completely moved. And he wasn't doing his, like, he does have different modes though, when you say and I'm being reductionist and silly, but he was actually, I'm talking about when I was listening to him at this time, it was just nasty ripping, just that fuzzed out, it was super heavy and
everything broken,
gorgeous. And I just goosebumps. And I remember he finished playing, and I just had to tell him, like, that was really moving. Like something happened, and he kind of had this childlike kind of look. Oh, really? Like, I was just kind of having fun.
Yeah, he was in his own universe, and he came back and went, oh, you were paying attention to that?
But he wasn't really playing like, I'm emoting now and feel this, and well, it was just like, sometimes, like, even when I've been at his gigs, when he's playing, it's almost like he's an observer of what he's doing too. Kind of like, whoa, check this out, dude. Like, can you believe
he's going on a journey and he's taking you along on his ride. And the only thing that you have
he's kind of on it too at the same time.
Yeah, he's on it at the same time. And all you have to do to participate is just sit back and excise yourself of any expectations and just, I went and saw him perform live, and I took my wife, and she'd never seen him play, and she'd listened to some of he'd been to the factory, you know, checking out stuff. And so you hear him stylistically, you know, going through his modes of the things that he does when he's checking out gear and stuff. And so she's familiar with what he does, but not having actually sort of emotionally connected with it. And so this is the first time that she'd been exposed to not only that, his sort of combination of his different sort of stylistic meanderings, but just in a live performance setting. And she said that was like going to some theme park and getting on some really bizarre ride. And what I really most enjoyed about it was just being on the ride, because you never knew what was going to happen next.
That's really cool.
It was like the Matterhorn, but you didn't know where the tracks were going to lead.
Yeah.
And I just thought about what she said, and I went, yeah, because that's what you do. You don't lay expectations on him.
No,
because he hasn't. At that point, he hadn't made anything sort of new for a while, and he was experimenting with new modes.
Wait a minute, was this at the Blue Whale?
It was before the Blue Whale.
Oh, okay, all right.
But by the time he got to the Blue Whale, he was starting to become his new sort of range of stuff that he was expressing, and so it was a little more refined at the Blue Whale, but it was the same reaction to the Blue Whale, where you just sat there and you just sit back, and all of a sudden you just sort of feel elevated and moving along with it. You didn't feel like you were sitting in a chair observing. You felt like you were being pulled along, and that's just so inspiring and amazing. And I love that. And I love that he's a pedal guy, and he's got a bunch of pedals, but they're sitting on the floor, and he spends a half an hour before the set setting the pedals on the floor and plugging them in and taping them down and making sure the knobs are all set right. And then he plugs into the amp, and he's got two power stations. One of them he's using as power for a couple extension speakers, and the other one he's actually using to load the amp down. It's only a 31 amp, the ether amp. It's only a 31 amp, but he's loading it down because he's got hearing problems on one ear, and he can't take very much volume, so he keeps everything really quiet. When he's performing, you have to whisper when you're talking to somebody because you can hear. Yeah, you could hear yourself talking, but so he meticulously sets up this rig, and then when he plays, you're waiting for the dynamic to get louder and him just fill the room full of sonic overload, and he doesn't do that. He gets up to a certain level where he's at his comfort level, and then he creates these loops and these genres that he goes through, and you at first I'm kind of going, I'm waiting for the big onslaught, and then I learned that with him there is no onslaught. The onslaught is
another really interesting thing.
You have to sort of internalize it, and then you're on let it happen to you, and then you're on the ride, but it's a totally different way of listening to music and experiencing it.
Yeah. And I tend to think about, when I listen to players, I sort of group them. I guess I'm classifying them like, what would I say? What is sort of at the forefront of what like some players, for instance, will, you can tell like rhythm is at the forefront of what they do. This is like, it's just relentless. The rhythms, or the groove or whatever. And it's funny because I remember seeing Torn at the Blue Whale, and it really hit me. Like there is no groove. and so, and I don't mean that as a pejorative. It was like, for him. And again, I feel, like this is reductionist, but it was texture is at the forefront. Like it was so deep, But I actually really, at that show, I remember feeling like I want to hear, because rhythm is kind of a lot of the basis of what I do and feel. Like I need to hear a groove. And then he did for like 15 seconds. There was like a groove thing in a loop. And then it was, kind of back to texture. But when I've been fortunate enough to be around him and listen to him play, I never felt like, oh, I'm going to go copy what he does. But I'm always so inspired to kind of re-examine a little bit, this instrument that I'm holding in my hands. Like maybe I've been thinking about it like in too small a box.
Or thinking about it too much.
That's possible. Yeah. I don't think about it too much anymore, but
but I think we as players do think about all these little elements, and we do kind of overthink them. In developing stuff, we overthink things, and then you have to scale the thinking back.
Mm-hmm.
And we also have to sort of communicate to our users and fans and observers out there that there's always this sort of searching around for where the boundary is.
Yeah.
And then deciding, okay, is this a boundary is this a boundary that we want to blow through because it's an artificial boundary that everybody just sort of adheres to because it's kind of like, it's like the canonistic sort of thing that you sort of adhere to because you adhere to it.
Yeah.
Is it time to blow that mess apart to get to the next thing? And in the process, you're going to anger people, you're going to lose people, and you're going to gain new people. And then eventually the people that got mad went, oh, I didn't quite understand it. Now that I understand it, okay, I get it,
Yeah.
And there's
Are we going to be the people who make the pickup with no personality?
Yeah, well, there's at least it was an effort to just sort of quantify something.
That's what I was saying. Like somebody needed to do that, and maybe
it's really funny. That's a great quote. And by the way, we got somebody here that posted the Mint. That was the gig that at the Mint in Hollywood that we first went on the Torn trip. But he had a drummer at the time. He had a drummer and I think he had a bass player. I don't remember, but he had a drummer. And having a drummer didn't mean that he had a groove. The drummer was like that avant-garde New York style free-form jazz drummer kind of guy that you had to figure out what his flams and what his triplets and what his bam, 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 bam thing with the cymbal,
wait a minute.
what that kind of stuff meant. It wasn't rhythmic. It was the drums being played as a vocal instrument, and so there wasn't a groove. It wasn't a groove thing that you got on.
Yeah.
And I'm with you. Sometimes I want Bootsy to show up and just like give us some ground.
Yeah, but you know what? I remember the first shop that I ever taught guitar at. The guy who owned the shop, he was telling me that he had been watching Branford Marsalis. And I don't know what tune Branford was playing, but I loved this because, I grew up around people who, if they didn't understand something, they would just talk crap about it and, dismiss it. And so I could tell when his name was Herb, when Herb started talking about Branford, I can tell that, he didn't really dig what was happening. And he said something that people always told me, when I was younger. And it was always in like the intro to them demeaning something. And it was, I'm a melody guy. I'm like, okay, you're about to tell me that Branford Marsalis doesn't, it's jazz and therefore there's no melody. He said, he says, but here's the thing, like, I'm a melody guy. I didn't hear any melody, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't melody. It probably just means that I didn't understand the melody that was being played. And, when somebody can kind of admit that, oh, maybe something's beyond my understanding, like I trust them way more. and I liked him so much more after he made that statement. And I completely forget where I was going with this and why I brought it up. What were you saying before I started talking
about rhythm?
Oh, yeah. So being at the Torrance show, I recognize that in myself. Like, yeah, I'm habituated to groove, and that's why I want it. And it's okay to not have it and just sit here in texture and just enjoy that and not, well, where's my groove? Where are the drums? Where, whatever makes me comfortable. Like, get over it for a moment.
Ultrasonic, yes, thank you.
Pickups in the 80s were ultrasonic pickups. You know what? I think
it was ultrasonic, and their logo was a tuning fork, a U.
Yeah,
and you know what's hilarious about it? They had a button at NAMM that had that ultrasonic U logo on it. It looked like a tuning fork, and the button said "suck tone." And the concept was, this is why language doesn't necessarily translate into understanding of a concept.
Mm-hmm.
The idea was to suck the tone out of the guitar using the EQ to enable you to get the subtle harmonic structure that you wanted to create using the EQ. But the pin just woefully just put a lasso around your ankles and yank your feet right out from under you and landed on your pointed little head, because it was like, why are you wearing that badge? And, this is the ultrasonic concept.
Might as well have said we suck. Yeah.
Oh boy, was that like a
no.
We need to have a little talk. Yeah, we need to have a little.
Exactly. Yeah.
Torn turned one of his friends onto the Ether amp one time, and the guy sent us an email, and he said, I can't describe what I just heard, so I'm just going to tell you how it seemed to me. The harmonics were like sprinkling themselves down around me from the ceiling, like little flashing Christmas tree lights, and then flickering out as they got near the floor.
I love that.
And I'm like, that is a compliment that you have to try to unpack, or else just think that somebody was impacted in that way, and the only way they can describe it is in just beautiful ethereal terms like that. Yeah. I don't even want to unpack it. I just want to try to imagine myself in that space and go, that's an awesome space that you found.
And just don't forget what he said.
And just don't forget what he said.
Yeah, that's
a beautiful thing, and just made me just go, I could just sort of understand what he was trying to say without necessarily trying to unpack it. It just was like great. It was just
those great. Are those, I can retire now kind of things.
Yeah.
Like, man.
I can die now. I heard a compliment that I can't even quantify, but I don't need to, because I know that the intent was all there, and it was just like the guy was just doing his very best to just try to articulate something that was impossible for him to articulate. It was amazing.
Well,
should we try to answer something? Should we try to even remotely try to?
I think that would be great, because there's a bunch of questions.
Any of these things. It's not, hey guys, we appreciate that you're here, and I love the fact that you're making comments and we're watching them, and we're just being too boneheaded to just like stop yakking for a second and attack someone. So let's try.
I'm away.
Let's look at well, first of all, do you see do you see anything that you'd like to take a shot at, Joe?
Okay, this is not answering a question at all, but when when Neil threw out the ultrasonic pickups, I wanted to know, can anybody remember anyone who was endorsing those? Like who actually if we had some sort of a sweepstakes, I'd love to give something away to somebody who could tell me that, because I think I remember those ads. But let's see. Steve, what's the difference between Synergy and the LX2 power amps?
All right. Okay, so this is going to be, if you've been following this far, then you were involved, you were listening to the conversation that we had where we were doing a counterpoint to Dave Friedman's comments about the power amp, the role of the power amp in the system. When we were involved in the outset of the relaunch of the whole modular concept under the Synergy brand. So we were in it from the very beginning of evolving the concept and how we were going to execute on it and what the feature set was going to be and all of that kind of stuff. So once that project sort of got underway, we started thinking about, okay, what's going to follow once we get the concept together and the updated new module platform, and how we were going to execute on the individual modules and how they were going to be same and how they were going to be different or evolved. And I was kind of a big proponent of just scrapping the whole old part of the concept and just starting from a clean sheet of paper. And another person on the team was concerned about the reverse compatibility part of it. Well, the people that have the old modules are going to be left out. And my attitude was, well, okay, but what we're trying to do is evolve the platform and evolve the concept. So there are some things that are limiting in the old platform and the old concept. So if we're going to truly make a forward move on all that, we need to let go of some of the old stuff. And that meant that the platform would interface with the module in a different way that would actually give the module more flexibility sonically. And the real progressive aspect of that lost out to the let's hang on to some reverse compatibility. So that to me sort of limited what you could do with the modules going forward. And that meant that in order to get out of the platform, which would be like the Syn 1 or the Syn 2 with the modules installed, that system, to get out of that to speakers, we were going to have to have a purpose-built power amp to really bring all the best of that out. Where the way I was thinking about it, it would be a little bit more independent of the power amp behavior. But at the end of the day, I mean, looking back at it now, I was really, like I'm always doing, like pushing ahead.
Right.
And I mean, I can be pretty annoying when I get that way, and I don't want to say that I was being just condescending to the other guys, but I guess my attitude was, do you buy the new iPhone because it behaves like the previous iPhone? And you don't buy an iPhone because it works like the one that you got rid of because it had all these sort of shortcomings. You get the new one because it's got all the new stuff that's fixed.
Yeah.
But they kind of had the idea that they didn't really know, and you never do when you're developing a product. You're never going to know if it's got legs until it's got legs.
Sure.
So sometimes you err on the conservative side, and sometimes you err on the progressive side, and sometimes you win a few, you lose a few. So on we go. So going and finally refining how we were going to do those products and how we were going to execute on them and what the final feature set was going to be and how that feature set worked. Then the next thing was, okay, so what are we going to do about the power amp? And And my attitude was, well, you know, we have the one space power amp, and it's innovative and it's unusual because it's a single space and it's got 4 power tubes in it, and it's going to scare a few people, but that's okay with us. You know, I mean, we're the kind of people that will take that chance. We don't expect you to, but if you're interested in that concept, you know, we'll license it to you and we'll refine it to work to be more optimized for that. And if you don't, then we'll just make maybe a refined version of the 252 power amp. We'll give you something in 2 spaces that maybe more to your liking. And so we sort of gave them the option of the 2. And after they kind of went around and around about it a while, they decided that they liked the single space concept. And then all that left was, all right, so how is it going to operate? And we were thinking, well, we kind of own this territory in the single space power amp that's got more than 20 watts a side in it, which is sort of unique. But I'm willing to forgo that because I actually believed in the Synergy project enough to where I felt it would be good for us to do that, and it would be a good move as far as the public facing part of it was concerned, to have that be represented as accepted in the marketplace, which by having 2 different versions of it on the marketplace would be a good thing. And it would expose the concept to people that normally wouldn't go for it. But since they were if they were convinced and enthusiastic about the Synergy concept in general, then the power amp, this is the power amp that goes with it. Okay, no brainer, right?
Yeah.
So that would make it, that would sort of legitimize the existence of the single space power amp. And if they had confidence in it that it was going to be, reliable and a good fit for the brand, then that would be good for their customer base. And that's the way it turned out.
Yeah.
How they conceive of the power amp is that the modules, they have different modules. And each module from each different manufacturer has its own little different personality. They have a lot of similarities from module to module in terms of the limitations of producing them. They each have 2 12AX7s in them. So 2 preamp tubes in each module max, because that's all that you can get in there. Mm-hmm. And then what you can practically do with the module configuration within those limitations. And then how you configure the platform, the Syn 2 and the Syn 1, to get the most out of the modules, and then the power amp needs to do the rest of the job.
Yeah.
And that's a little different angle than how we were approaching the LX2, which is that we have a certain, and we're trying to say this without sounding like an egotistical bastard, but we have a certain ownership of the power amp space because we've just spent so much time doing it, refining it,
Yeah.
And it
ain't bragging if you can back it up, Steve.
It's just a personal love of mine. It goes way, way back. I would love to just drag out, go in the other room, and I'm at home in my man cave, but I have my 1960s stereo monoblocks in the living room in our stereo system that use KT88s. It's just like I grew up on that. I was like steeped in it from the age of 13, 14, 15. It's just like power, voltage, tubes, more of them.
Yeah.
But it just so happens that these Dynaco monoblocks use 2 KT88s, and there's one for each channel, and they were kits and they were fun to build, and maybe they're not the most hi-fi, the most articulate, most amazing power amps ever created for tubes, but they are wonderful sounding and they behave beautifully and they sound great with our records, and I just love power amps. So that's all I got to say about power amps. Is it's just like there aren't enough tube power amps for guitar players on the planet to suit me. There always can be more. And so when they suggested that the power amp needs to be more fine-tuned to give the modules an ampy sort of a quality, I went, yeah, I agree with that. And then when they said, so we want it going back to Dave, we want it to be more like sort of like the long tail pair, the sort of martially performance, blah blah blah. I totally get that, dude. I totally do. But then we go back to the age-old discussion of what is the role of the power amp, and if the synergy concept, if you totally are buying into your own concept, which is synergy, all these different manufacturers coming together, these different designers coming together to groupthink the whole concept and contribute to that. And that in that case, every single manufacturer's module has to have its own reason to exist. And I've used that phrase many times in this episode and in the previous episode, because it's the central operating philosophy of our company, that every product has to have a reason to exist. And what that means is that there's a problem to solve, or there's something that my buddy Pat Quilter of QSC and Quilter Amplifiers has told me from time to time. It's just like, hey, Pat, why did you do this way? And his answer was, it needed to be done, and it needed to be done right. And it was the sort of the same, different way of saying the same thing, which is it had a reason to exist.
Yeah.
There's a place in there. There's in the pantheon of all the stuff that's out there that guitar players can have, there are holes. And if you're observing everything that's out there, there are these little holes, and there's places where we can apply our specialty into those holes and come up with something to fill that hole. And that's its reason to exist. It solves this issue, or it fixes a problem that maybe even people aren't aware of, but we see it and think that has a reason. There's ample reason for us to spend our time and effort and resources into filling that thing. Dynakit, yeah, it was Dynaco if you bought the assembled product, and was Dynakit if you bought the kit and assembled it yourself. And that was how, if after you built it and sold it, the person who bought it would know if you bought it and built it and sold it, or if it was factory accepted kit. Right. So that was the dynamic there. And the reason for 2 single space 6L6 power amps to exist in the marketplace are simple. The SYN 5050 is designed to not only sound more like a guitar power amp, voiced power amp that enhances and sort of completes the mission of the preamp, which is to sound like an amp, that you put effects between the preamp and the power amp, and you have something that sounds and feels and responds like an amp. But also doesn't impose its personality too much, thus the 6L6s, which tend to be more transparent. And I've used that word reticently because people have really screwed up ideas about what the word transparent means. But
that's another episode.
The reason to use 6L6s was to basically ensure that we could produce the power amp that tended to stay out of its own way, in terms of not making sure that all the modules sounded like the individual modules, that they didn't all sound the same.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just going to use the effects return of my Mesa for the power amp because it's a great power amp. Congratulations, all your Mesa, all your modules, your Bogner module, your Engel module, your Fryette module, your Friedman module, they're all going to sound like they've got Mesa hot sauce poured on top of them.
Yeah, I hope you like Mesa.
Yeah. And that's a wonderful concept. And maybe you like that power amp, and maybe that even works for you. Great. More power to you if it does. But it's not the concept on which the foundation of the whole reason for the brand and the product range to exist was formulated. So that's why both of the amps have 6L6s, this LX2 and the SYN 5050. But the SYN 5050 has presence and depth controls on the front, and they're very active presence and depth controls. They do a lot. And that's one thing that Friedman was really adamant about, was he wanted those knobs to do a lot. He didn't want any subtlety, like just because there's people out there that go, I don't really get that the presence control doesn't really do that much, or the depth control. I want more. I want more. And I think a lot of times when people say they want more, they don't really want more. They want to know that there's more available if they want it, but they don't.
Oh yeah, no, I actually buy into that concept. I like that a lot.
Turn it up to the point where it's too much, and then back it off to the point where it's right.
Well, we were talking about that.
What I do is I go, that's too much. Nobody's in their right mind is going to want that much. So I'm just going to make it go to this, so that it doesn't have to go too far to come back. And the person who wants it, who says I wanted to go too far and then take it back, are going to have an issue with that and say, no, but that's how I know that it's right.
Yeah, well, it's that whole thing of
it's the whole thing of liking something for the wrong reason.
Well, remember when we were talking about certain people, like I'm never going to run a 100-watt amplifier up full, but I like it anyway. Right? Remember that whole sort of thing? The 100 versus 50, and some people just prefer it, and it's sort of like I remember one of my friends, he had I think it was like a 73 Dodge Demon, and dude, like you sit in this thing, like it's an incredible looking car, but you sit in it and it's like, oh, this is like a grandma car, old school, super bench seat. It's like you're sitting on your couch. It's the most comfortable thing. This could be a grocery getter, but dude, if you step on the gas, it's over with, And a lot of those old muscle cars were kind of like that. You could kind of, tool around town and you don't have to drive like a maniac, but should you want to?
There's validity to both sides of that. And
I agree.
For example, one of the things that I really felt that on our amplifiers, the tone control should actually do something.
Yeah.
Because I came from the school where in the mid 80s, JCM 800s, the tone controls didn't do shit.
Yeah, of course.
And
they're there to be turned all the way up.
SLO 100s, the tone controls don't do that much either. Oh. The beauty of it in SLO is the SLO has got its own sort of DNA that it doesn't really demand tweaking the tone controls that much to get it. It's sort of like all of a piece. In the JCM 800, what they did is, it's not that the tone controls don't work as well. They work just like every other tone stack and every Marshall ever worked. But what they did, which was intelligent in terms of execution, in terms of intent, but sort of failed in execution, was this. In a Marshall amp where the tone controls are wired with a bundle of wire going back to the board behind the front panel, there's a certain amount of bleed through that bundle of wires that's going from the controls to the board because they twist it into a bundle.
Okay.
So the signal that's going from the board that drives the tone stack and then comes back off the treble control, that's basically the output of the tone stack. That means that the input and output of the tone stack are kind of running in parallel. But they're not really running in parallel because they're kind of spaced apart and they're sort of twisted around. And they're bundled with the other wires. So the spacing isn't really consistent. And it's generally
scattered.
It's wide enough that the tone controls work, but they're close enough together that there's some bleed between the input and output of the tone control circuit. So if you straightened out all of those wires and isolated them from each other, the tone controls in the Marshall stack would work so well that you would effing hate them.
I can't believe that. Really?
The treble would be so bright and the mid would cut so much and all this stuff. And so the first time that somebody brought one in, oh yeah, this is a warranty problem. I just bought this amp new and the tone controls don't work. And I opened it up and I looked in it and I pulled the circuit board. It was the first full circuit board version where the pots were mounted on the circuit board.
Yeah.
I flipped the board over and I'm looking at it and I go, bing! Oh my God, look. So what they had done was, because the pots are mounted on the board, And when you're laying out a circuit board, you try to keep all the signals as short as possible to minimize crosstalk, to minimize capacitance, to minimize all these sort of side effects of a bad board design. They were actually trying to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
And they also, it's apparent looking at that board that they recognized that by separating all of that, they were losing the interaction of the input and the output bleeding over each other. So you can see on the board that a signal comes over from the tone stack driving circuit to the part of the board where the output of the treble control goes to the next stage. They're coming together, and then they drop down and they form a little parallel line, and then they split off and go off to the tone controls.
Okay.
What they did was they tried to emulate the bleed through of the input and the output by making the signals in a parallel line on the circuit board, which is a totally legitimate use of a circuit board. That's exactly what I've always said about PCBs is once you get the dynamics worked out of the interaction between the components and the signals on the board, you've locked them in for all time, and you
it's more
on it the same way every time, and that would help eliminate the problem that people always had with Marshalls. Everyone sounds different. You know why? Because that bundle of wires twisted together different every time.
Yeah, like I said, it's almost like scatter winding. Like, how are you going to duplicate that?
Exactly. So the only problem is they just did it too well, and there was too much bleed between the input and the output. So what I did was I cut those parallel traces out, and I took a twisted pair of wire, insulated wire, and I made a little twisted pair, and I tag soldered them to the points before it got to that parallel point and floated it in the air. So I basically bypassed those two parallel copper traces with a twisted pair of wire off the board. So it's floating in the air.
Yeah. And
I gave it back to the guy, and he goes, "That's effing amazing. I don't know, how did you do that? Must have been a lot of work." And I said, "Yeah, it took me a while to sort of think it through, and I tried it a couple of different bundles until I came up with where it worked." And he goes, "Yeah, so that's under warranty, right?" And I said, No. They designed it that way intentionally. They're not going to cover it under warranty. That's going to be a mod."
Yeah.
And that was after I left Valley Arts. That was after I was already kind of sick of the mod thing, and the mod deal all along was a thing about getting the amplifier that you liked just to that other little extra level that you thought you would like it better.
Yeah.
And the sales job from the mod guy was that, I'm going to add that extra little piece that's missing that you always wish was there.
Mm-hmm.
And what they're not going to tell you is, in doing so, the other part of the amp that you really like is never going to be there.
Yeah.
You're going to sacrifice something about the amp that you did like
the ecosystem.
Yeah, you're gonna get a little and you're gonna lose a little, and then it always becomes, this is what was problematic with the mod business, is that once the player was confronted with what they had lost in order to accomplish what they had gained, they would immediately have second thoughts, and they would want to come back and go, "I didn't want that much. I want you to And so then you're going, okay, the mod was $150, and now you want me to go do that same amount of work again, to just sort of do it halfway or something." And then the argument always became, "But I paid you." And, "Yeah, but I'm not a mind reader."
Right.
And there's this other thing that gets in the way called the real world, and we have that to contend with, reality. So, and that was like where guys like Lee Jackson. His policy was, you pay $350 for the mod, and I'm done with you. That's the mod. There's no refund. This is my mod. I'm not catering to your tastes. I'm selling you the Lee Jackson mod. And there was some brilliance in that. Genius.
So want it or don't. That's what you get.
I'm selling you what you're coming to me asking me to give you what I sell.
Yeah. I'm not customizing the soup for you.
Right. This is my soup. You're buying Campbell's tomato soup because you want Campbell's tomato soup, and it's not $350. And if you don't like it, tough. Don't buy it next time.
Yeah.
And
I don't want to hear from you anymore.
I don't want to hear from you anymore. And he was very adamant about it. God bless him. He had the balls to say, "This is the line. You don't
be gone."
And then that frustrated person would come to me and go, "I had this done and I just don't like it." and can you fix it? And I said, I don't want to fix his mod because I don't know where you live. So the best thing to do is let's get the amp back to stop and see what is really about it that was missing that you didn't like, that we really want to try to recreate. Yeah. And so I would charge them to put the amp back to stock.
Yeah.
And that was the end of my days working at the repair shop. I started, and Lee Jackson actually said, oh, you don't like it? Okay, here's the guy you call. And he would give him my phone number, and I would charge them.
You're the unmod guy.
I'm the unmod guy.
Wow.
And I started doing all these when people started getting tired of getting mods and started doing all this stuff.
I think, you know, that's giving people a lot of credit, you know, for thinking that they really thought through what they want. I think a lot of people, again, would read guitar magazines. Somebody would mention, oh yeah, you know, their favorite artist. Oh yeah, I got such and such a mod. And Joe Schmo in their bedroom, you know, not even playing gigs. Oh, well then therefore I need that mod. Not even considering, you know, what it would do for them. They have no particular vision for themselves. You know, and I'm not looking down on anyone for that, because I was one of those people. I did that sort of thing too. And then you do that enough times, you go, oh, wait a minute, I should probably get an idea about actually what I want. Right.
Yeah.
And not just chase what that guy did.
And you know what's, as we sit here today, the reduction of all that is that what you were trying to accomplish is the sound of the amp at a setting that you liked that was untenable setting for everybody else. So what the mods were intended to do was to affect the behavior of the amp so that it would behave the way you wanted it to at the volume that you wanted to play it at. And what is that? Where are we going with that, boys and girls? We're explaining how the attenuation thing goes hand in hand with the mod thing as the incomplete solution to getting the amp that I love the way it is to behave the way I want it to behave when I want it to at the volume that I can manage, that everybody else can manage. And that's an awful hell of a lot to ask of one amp to do in and of itself, because it's designed to be used a variety of ways in a variety of circumstances, and everybody plays different, and every guitar is different, and every pickup is different, and every style is different. And every reason for it to exist for the player is different. Yeah. And so how do you sort of bridge all that gap? And the bridge is to figure out a way to manage the behavior of the amp as it is without impacting its own internal design. Because why did you like it in the first place? Because when you set it this way, it's heavenly. And yeah, I can relate to that. I went that whole route. You did it with Marshalls. I did it with high watts. It was the same thing. It all came back to, you know what I really need to do? I just really need to be able to set it like this because that's the way I like it, and not get thrown out of the band or thrown out of the club.
How come when I went in that room, it didn't do it that time? And then how come when I went in that studio, it didn't do it that time? And I did all the same stuff.
Right. And you just put your finger entirely on the thing, which is it's an environmental variable.
Oh man,
you're trying to solve with resistance capacitors inside the amp, and it's a fruitless exercise.
I gotta tell you real fast, because it came up, and I remember the first studio session that I did at a real commercial facility. I had this stupid. I think I was running a 3 amp rig. Oh, what? I think I had it was a matchless Chieftain 112, a Roland JC 120, and I think a Mesa Tremoverb combo or something like that. But no. Actually, I had a. Oh, anyway, it doesn't matter. But I was using, actually, for one of the amps, I was using the Marshall Power Break. Remember that thing? And anyway, I had been in rehearsals. This is with the band. This wasn't a session that I was getting paid for. this was a band that I was in, and I'd been in this rehearsal room, rehearsing and getting my sound. And then I get into the studio, I set everything up, I do everything the same. And like, I can't get anything out of this rig. Like nothing is working. And it's so bad. Like I'm folding mentally. And the engineer, who was a really well-known guy in town, everybody respected him. He actually comes out to me and he walks over, he looks at my rig and he goes, yeah, I'm pretty busy in there right now, but I'm gonna have to come out here in a little bit and help you out with this, because right now this sounds fifth grade. Like, can I quit music now? Like, I was so crushed, and I didn't know how to troubleshoot. I had no idea what was going on with my own gear. But, it was just, okay, I moved it out of this room. I came in here, and now everything that was great is gone, and I don't know what to do.
I think my specific talent is troubleshooting, and I've always valued the process of troubleshooting, because what you have to do, and it's really difficult to do, because what's happening in the environment where you have to do it is there's unbelievable pressure being exerted on you, because you're being asked to perform, you're being asked to whatever your problem is, just effing solve it, and we're paying you to be a professional, and why are you bringing your headaches into this process? And you don't really understand the environmental variables of the problem that you're dealing with that's creating all this angst, and that's putting pressure on you and creating a feedback loop where you're just going, I give up. I'm just going to strip it out down to nothing and just play straight in, and I'm just going to make the best of a bad situation, and I'm out.
Yeah.
And
I actually quit the band that day. I did.
That's a solution. I
quit. And I said, I can't do this. And fortunately, the band leader, he believed in me, and I left the studio. I was that crushed. Like I'm not cut out for this. And they got me back on the record during the overdub process at another studio.
Yeah, it's not just you.
I learned a ton from that situation, though.
Yeah, troubleshooting is an art in and of itself. And Tone Guy 007 just posts, troubleshooting is divide and conquer, isolate and fix. Absolutely. You have to be aware enough of the holistic environment that you're in, and be able to on the fly examine what's going on, where you are, how what's going on where you are may be different than what was going on where you were somewhere else, where you weren't having that problem, and extrapolate the problem out of what changed between those two environments. And I would run into that with tech guys on the road all the time. When they're on the front lines, they're freaking out. They're not tech. They're called guitar techs or amp techs, but their tech is just a glorified way of saying
I can set stuff up.
I can hook stuff up, but if I hook stuff up and it doesn't work, then I'm fucked. Oops. And who am I going to land on, right? And I sort of prided myself in being the guy that, like, okay, when you get out there and you run into a problem, call me. Just call. Mm-hmm. And I do that because when I was starting out at Valley Arts, and I had Larry Carlton and Carlos Rios and all these studio greats that were depending on their gear, and they were in a pressure situation and they needed a quick fix. The manufacturers of the gear that they were using, I wasn't the manufacturer, but I was the guy that they called to fix the problem. And I had those manufacturers text at my back. I could call them and say, I got Jay Graydon. I've got whoever in a situation. They're recording a track with Glenn Campbell and they're having a problem, and they're like, okay, here's what's going on, just do this and tell them to do that and blah 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 blah. And I'd get back on the phone with the artist, and I would tell them what I was told, and they would go do that, and they were like, man, you saved a $50,000 session. Wow. Thanks so much. So when we started doing the manufacturing and those guys out in the field would call me, I just felt like, because I know the answer.
Yeah, and you want to
I know the answer.
You want to be good to people.
You know, so I sort of relished in the fact when somebody was out on the road and go, yeah, hey, I'm out with Vi, and we're in Indianapolis at the venue, and there's no sound coming out of classic power amp, and like, do I need to change all the fuses? Do I need to blah 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 replace all the speakers? Dude, calm down, count to 10, answer me 2 questions. Look at the back of the power amp and see where the speaker cables are going into the back of the power amp. You see those 2 speaker jacks? Yeah. They're plugging into the speaker jacks. Okay, read underneath the speaker jack. You see underneath the speaker jack, it says use first. Yeah, use first. Yes. I said, are you plugged into the speaker jack that says use first? No, I'm plugged into the one next to that one. And I said, okay, unplug it from that one and plug into the one that says use first. Do that on both channels. Oh, okay. Use. It's like, dude, you're a fucking genius. Thank you very much. Bye. Click. You know, back to the stage. Artist comes out on the stage to start the first song, and I saved his life. He just got in a panic situation. He couldn't see.
Yeah.
And I have to be the guy taking the deep breath, going, take a deep breath, calm down, count to 5. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to go step by step. Please stop panicking and just listen. And I would talk like this. Dave, you know, the robot, the computer in 2001. I really enjoyed working with you, Dave.
Yeah.
No,
I was too mired in my own, zero self-esteem.
You just have to go, I'm sitting in a comfortable chair in Southern California in beautiful weather, and this guy's in Indianapolis losing his effing shit.
Yeah.
And I have the luxury of perspective. Plus, I know something about what might be going on. So I start from the dumbest, simplest things first, and we'll work our way back. And if you really are in trouble, we'll know soon enough. And then we'll know that we have to employ some emergency procedures. But before then, probably 8 times out of 10, it's something as simple as this. And I won't say dumb, because you're under a lot of pressure to do a lot of stuff in a short amount of time. And things always go wrong, right? So,
yeah.
So
my favorite is when I'm sitting there tracking and I'm going, man, where did I just had my pick in my hand. I just had my pick. Where I'm looking around, and 5 minutes later, it's like, oh, it's in my mouth between my teeth.
Well, I've just,
something that's simple and silly.
Yeah, the whole thing is and we've been going on pretty long, and it's been pretty spirited, and the comments have been great, and people are like really following. They're not asking a lot of questions, which is great, because a lot of people are commenting that they're like really sort of picking up on what's going on, and they're relating to the conversation, and it's and there's some cool stuff here. I just think
there are some really good questions in there. We didn't maybe we need to do an episode where we don't have a theme other than going back and answering some of these questions that people have asked in these first 2 episodes.
Yeah, but okay, so let's just wrap up the mod versus attenuation thing, and just talk really quickly about what attenuation is. So attenuation is not using a particular device with a particular amplifier. That's not what attenuation is. Attenuation is reducing a signal level, reducing a volume level. That's all it is. We're just turning the volume down. That's attenuation. Boost is turning the volume up. In a traditional attenuator, the only thing it can do is attenuate. Thus, it's just considered an attenuator. It only turns the volume down. It starts from bypass, which is unity gain, and then when you activate it, there's a slight amount of reduction in level, or there's a lot, depending on how it's designed. And then there's the 6 position or 5 position or 3 or 4, whatever the rotary switch is, or if it's a rotary pot, it doesn't necessarily have a position, but every position from all the way up is down. It's attenuating. Henning Polly calls it quieter maker, which is a great way to put it. And then turning it up, he describes that as a louder maker.
That's right. I remember that.
Right. So to put it in really simplistic terms. So is the power station a reamp? And to the guys who asked the question, can you make the power station attenuator part without the power amp?
Mm-hmm.
No, because
the power load, but it's not the power station.
But it's not an attenuator. It is just a load, and the load in the power station is just a load. Its only function is to be a load, not to apportion any power to the speaker. The thing that's sending the signal to the speaker to drive the speaker is the power amp. So the power station doesn't work without the power amp. Does that make it a reamper? Technically, yes, but what it really is a device that when you're turning the volume down, it's an attenuator. And when you're turning the volume up from what your amp that you had plugged into it was normally at, if you're turning it louder than that, then it's a booster. Is it a reamp? Well, reamping in recording terms has its own sort of understanding of what that process is. And I don't like characterizing the power station as a reamper. Does it take a small signal and reamp it back up to a level? Yes, it does. But that's a different concept than what people normally can consider reamping in the recording sense of the conversation, where you lay down a track and then you take that raw track off of a track and run it out to an amp and then put it back onto another track so that it sounds different. That's technically, in the recording lingo, reamping. What we're doing is simply replacing the problematic attenuator, or the resistive switching matrix of resistors in an attenuator, with a tube power amplifier to drive the speaker. Mm-hmm. Why? Because then we can just have a variable volume control that we can set to boost or cut, to attenuate or increase. So the other thing that's important about this kind of method of attenuation is that it restores the relationship of the speaker to a tube power amplifier. It doesn't have to be exactly the same kind of tube power amplifier as that's in your tube amp, because your tube amp is already doing that job when it's feeding the reactive load in the power station. It's already establishing its sonic profile. And it's already reacting like it's plugged into a speaker because it's plugged into the reactive load of the attenuator. And if you don't like the way it's reacting with the reactive load in the power station, you can use the little switches to adjust it so that you do like the way that it's interacting with the reactive load. That's why we have a reactive load that has different sets of behaviors, so that you can find the combination that works best with that amp and then send the product of that to the amp through a power amp that's more neutral. It's not as expressive and not infused with as much personality as the power amp in your amp, but it doesn't need to be. What it does do is it still, in the perspective of the impedance relationship between the speaker and the power amp, it does the job of allowing the speaker to wishy-washy back and forth, interact with the behavior of the power amp in the same way the speaker did when it was connected directly to your amplifier. Mm-hmm. So that is a reactive behavior also. It's more subtle than what your amp is doing when it's plugged directly to the cab. Mm-hmm. It's supposed to be, because it's supposed to be less intrusive sonically, but we still want to reintroduce the reactive component between the speaker and the power amp stage so that it's recognizable and feels natural.
Feels, bingo. Yeah.
Then you can astute observers of this are saying, well, isn't that two reactive loads together? Yes, it's the whole point. Because some of the reactive behavior between the reactive load, any reactive load, and the amp is going to be a little artificial. And some of the reactive behavior between the tube power amp and the speaker is not going to be exactly what you had when you plug the amp directly into the speaker. But the combination of the two is going to be equal to or even more than what you originally had. And you can adjust that and fine tune it to get it either perfect, or even better. I want a little more top end. I want a little more thump. I want a little tighter relationship on the bass. You can get those things. And that goes back to what you were trying to do when you modded the amp in the first place and it was unsuccessful. You not only use the power station to compensate for the sound of your amp that you want to have within the environmental limitations that you're in. And that means you really want the amp to behave this way, but it doesn't behave that way until you A, mod it, or B, connect to your power station and turn it the way you want it, and then use the power station to refine what came out so that it is the way you want it, which is effectively modding the amplifier. So now you don't have to mod the amp anymore. You can use any stock amp and get that behavior. In a rack system now, when we're talking about new racks, same thing. You take your amp that you like, plug it into the power station and run that to your cab, and then take the line out and run that at 2FX into another power amp and do a wet dry system, or you can do what Mike Nielsen did in his video and plug the power station into itself and make it react to its own reactive load, and then send that to the DAW. And, there's just like infinite number of ways that you can either retain the sound and feel and behavior of your amplifier at whatever volume you need it to be at, or in or connected to any outboard gear in any way that you need to be able to connect it, without screwing with the original personality or the functionality of your amp. And there's just like nothing better than that.
Right.
And with that,
and the final thing that I'll say, I often think about this with the power station is what you originally called it on the front panel. I think it was the integrated reactance amplifier. Like nobody, I mean, that kind of says it all, but we don't go around, we don't bandy that around as what it is. We just kind of refer to it, people are, oh, it's the new attenuator on the block.
Like, and we needed to characterize it in a way that this is what it really is. Because if we called it one thing, then we knew that we would run up against the people who go, well, it's not really that.
But then it got reduced to the one thing anyway. And
reduced to the one thing anyway. But the fact is that what it is doing is it's taking the reactive behavior between your amp and it's the reactive load and amplifying that reactive behavior. So it's the integration of the reactive load in your amp. So it's the integrated reactance of those two pieces together, amplifying that into your speaker, and then your speaker is reacting to the tube power amp in a way that only tube power amps can. Solid state amps, I don't care how good, whether they're analog, whether they're class AB, whether they're FET power amps or class D, I don't care what it is, if it's a solid state power amp. And that's not to say that solid state power amps are inferior to tube power amps. They are just inherently different animals that operate a different way. And they will never operate, no matter how many manufacturers say, this is the tube sound FET MOSFET, blah, 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 blah. The very nature of the solid state power amp operation and function it's an evolution of tube power amplifiers, and it solves problems that tube power amplifiers have always had. The only thing with guitar players is we don't want that problem solved.
Exactly.
Thank you very much.
Exactly.
That problem was the problem that I want. That was the part I wanted to keep.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, should we call it, guys?
Absolutely, because
almost 3.5 hours.
I've got a quesadilla here I got to dive into.
All right. Well, you go do that. Thank you so much, everybody, for hanging out with us.
Thank you all for sticking it out this long. And we actually had a really good we solved the connection issues of the previous episode, and that was awesome. So that means we're going to have outro music, right? We're not going to have the outro play.
I don't have an outro. Steve, you're gonna have to sing it.
Then replay the intro.
Oh, okay. You know what? That'll work very well. All right. Yeah. When's the next one, Steven? The next one, yeah, there it is. You're how do I do this? Yeah, now I'm pointing. Hey, look. Okay, Steven, yeah, we'll be up 2 weeks from today. Same thing. We're gonna do this every 2 weeks. So thanks for asking. And here's our outro, and we'll see you in 2 weeks, guys. Thank you so much.
Thanks for hanging out. Cheers, guys.